The mage hurled a fireball at him, and the guy was written off as a failure. Not a single spark, not a drop of magic, empty hands against the flames. But the man who woke up in this body looks at the white coating of bird droppings on the cliffs and smiles, because he is the only one in the whole world who knows that it's saltpeter, and saltpeter is gunpowder. At first there was cold. A rock strikes his back. A wet wind lashes his face. His body won't obey him. His fingers feel like someone else's. His legs feel like someone else's. A dull pain shoots through his left knee, and he understands. This pain is old. It's not his. He opens his eyes. A gray sky creeps overhead. The clouds are like dirty cotton wool. It smells of the sea and rot. A wagon creaks nearby. Daniel Rains lunges to sit up and nearly falls off the side. He looks at his hands, thin, pale, veins visible beneath the skin. He's 34, and his palms are as rough as sandpaper from machine tools and wood shavings. But these are a boy's hands. No calluses, no burns. His heart is pounding so hard that his vision goes dark. And he remembers. The night shift, the road home, the headlights of a truck, a crash, then nothing. And then this cold and this stranger's body. A stranger's memory lies in his head like a box of old photographs. A man with icy eyes. His father, the Duke of Westmark. His two older brothers. One laughs in his face. The other turns away. The dueling circle. Opposite him stands a boy his own age, and a flame wraps around his fingers like a living glove. And Davin von Westmark has nothing. A fireball strikes his shoulder and hurls him onto the rocks. Daniel touches his shoulder. A scar under his shirt. Raised. Old. So it's true. So he's trapped in the body of a 20-year-old aristocrat who was written off like a defective part on an assembly line. The wagon jolts over a rock and he clings to the side. To the right is the sea, gray and heavy, stretching to the horizon. Waves crash against the cliffs, sending spray flying upward. To the left is bare rock. Not a tree in sight. Only scrub clings to the crevices. The road runs along the cliff's edge, and one misstep could send the cart tumbling down. But the driver knows the way. The cart crawls up the hill, and a small town comes into view below. If you can even call it a town. Crooked roofs, gray walls, a pier with 3 boats, one of which is sinking right at the dock. Not a wisp of smoke from the chimneys, not a single one. So the forges are idle. The workshops are idle. The stoves in the houses aren't lit. Daniel counts. 14 buildings. The stone is crumbling. The roof of the nearby house has sagged like an old horse's back. A name surfaces from someone else's memory. Greystone. A rocky peninsula in the northwest of the kingdom of Aerland. A land that yields nothing. A place where those they wish to forget are exiled. His own father exiled him here, officially to learn to govern, in reality to die quietly and not bring shame upon the family name. Daniel exhales. He counts. He is dead. 1. He is in a foreign world, in a foreign body. 2. The body is lame and weak. 3. All around him is stone and poverty. 4. And in 6 months, war will come here because the Tevran Empire has been gathering strength on its western borders for 20 years, and Greystone lies directly in the path of the invasion. 5. Everyone at court knows this. That's why they sent him here. The cart rolls downhill. The driver turns around. An old man, wrinkled. His eyes dart about. He says they've arrived, and from here on, His Grace will take it from there. His voice trembles. Not out of respect, out of fear. He's afraid of this place. Daniel climbs out of the wagon. His leg gives out and he falls to one knee in the mud. The coachman doesn't help. Daniel gets up on his own. He brushes himself off. Up close, it's even worse. The walls are cracked. The road is unpaved. Puddles. It reeks of fish and sour milk. 2 men by the house are staring at him. One spits. They know who he is. The Duke's son. A magicless freak. An exile. Daniel straightens up. His leg hurts. His back hurts. Everything hurts. But his mind is clear, crystal clear, because Daniel Rains spent 12 years designing firearms at a factory in Hartford. He modernized army carbines. He restored Mausers in his garage in the evenings. He cast bullets for muzzle-loading muskets with his own hands. He remembers blueprints ranging from 14th century arquebuses to the .3-inch caliber rifle of 902. He remembers the chemistry of gunpowder and ballistic tables. And here he stands in a world where mages cast fireballs and common folk die quietly because they have nothing but their bare hands. But he has gunpowder. The entire history of firearms, from the bamboo tube to the Maxim machine gun, lies in his head like a library with its doors wide open. He looks at the two men by the wall. They see a limping boy in a worn raincoat. They see a victim. He sees a raw piece of material, 2 future soldiers, or 2 future workers, or both. Daniel walks down the road toward the center. He limps. He scans every house, every wall, every roof. An engineer looks at the materials, and there are materials here. Stone, lots of stone, suitable for walls and foundations. Clay by the shore, suitable for molds. There's almost no wood. That's a problem, but a solvable one. Peat drifts in from the swamp behind the hill. Fuel. Poor quality, but fuel nonetheless. Fish in the sea. Food. Something white on the rocks. He peers closely. Bird droppings. A thick layer. Old. His heart is pounding. Guano. It's saltpeter. One of the 3 components of gunpowder lies right on the rocks of this god-forsaken peninsula, and no one knows what it is. No one but him. He steps out onto the square. Square is a bit of an exaggeration. A trampled patch of ground between 4 houses. A well, a barrel, a dog. Across from it stands a larger building. Above the door, a piece of sheet metal with a hole in it, a former sign, a blacksmith's shop. Daniel peeks inside. It's dark. The forge is cold. The ashes are old. Tools lie on the floor. A hammer, pliers. The anvil is heavy, real steel. This is the first thing that has made him happy since he woke up. The anvil represents the blacksmith shop, and the blacksmith shop represents the town. An old man is sitting on a bench, big hands, scorched forearms. A leather apron is rolled up nearby. He's staring at the wall. His eyes are empty. A memory from someone else's mind surfaces. Hollis, the blacksmith of Greystone. 3 weeks ago, his son Tom drowned. A net pulled him under the boat, and he couldn't get out. Since then, Hollis hasn't lit the forge. Daniel enters. The old man doesn't look up. Daniel says he needs the forge. Silence. Daniel says he knows about Tom, that he won't lie about time healing all wounds, but that he has a blueprint in his head for a device that can cut any rope in a single stroke, and a device that can pull a person out of the water in 10 seconds, that if Tom had had it, he'd still be alive, and that he'll build it. But he needs a bellows and a blacksmith's hands. Hollis looks up. His eyes are red and swollen. He asks who this kid is and why he's barging into his smithy. Daniel replies, "He's the new lord of Greystone, and he'll make sure no fisherman ever drowns in a net again." The old man stares for a long time. Then he stands up. He walks over to the forge. He looks at the ashes. He turns and says the coal ran out 3 days ago. Daniel nods. The first problem. Not the last, but solvable. Everything is solvable if you know the sequence. And he does. He steps outside. A man is already walking toward him. Tall, upright, a scar across his forehead, chainmail under his cloak, a military gait. Corbin Wade, a former sergeant in the Royal Infantry, captain of the local garrison, if 7 old men with blunt swords can be called a garrison. Wade stops 3 paces away. He looks down on him. He sees a limping boy in a dirty cloak, magicless. Without. He says he's been waiting 3 days and the rooms are ready. His voice is even. Neither respect nor hostility. A soldier doing his job. Daniel asks how many people are in town. A little over 2,000. Fishermen, old men, women, children, about 50 fugitive convicts who've settled here over the years. Daniel asks if there are any skilled workers among the convicts. Craftsmen, carpenters, bricklayers. Wade raises an eyebrow. No one had ever asked about the convicts before. They were tolerated and people tried not to notice them. He replies that a couple of men know how to use tools. Daniel says he wants to see them all in the square tomorrow morning. All the convicts, all the skilled workers, everyone who works with their hands. And he also needs a list of everything in town. Every sack of grain, every coil of rope, every piece of metal. Wade stares for a few seconds. Then he says, "Exactly." And he leaves. Not because he believed it, but because there are no other orders anyway. Daniel is left alone. A dog approaches and sniffs his boot. Skinny, ribs sticking out, just like everything else around here. He looks up at the sky. Clouds are creeping westward. In 6 months, the Tevran army will arrive from that direction. 2,000 infantry, 300 knights in enchanted armor, 4 battle mages, and he has 2,000 fishermen and a cold forge. And 6 months. Daniel sits down and pets the dog. She licks his hand. He speaks to her quietly in English. "Okay, there's nothing here but rocks and bird shit. But bird shit is saltpeter. Saltpeter is gunpowder. Gunpowder is guns. And guns are equality." The dog wags her tail. She didn't understand a word, but she's the first person in this world who hasn't looked at him with contempt. Daniel stands up. His leg hurts. He walks toward his new home. A stone box, 2 stories, a hole in the roof patched with a rag. Inside, a table, a bed, a stove, a candle. He sits down at the table. He finds a piece of coal. He finds a plank, and he draws. The first thing he draws isn't a gun. It's a stove. A simple cast-iron stove with a chimney. Because winter will come in a month, and if he doesn't keep these people warm, there'll be no one left to shoot. Second, he draws a wood-turning tool, a stick with a blade, for wood. Third, a mold for casting lead bullets. A spoon will do. Fourth, a diagram of a flintlock, the simplest design. Flint strikes steel. A spark falls onto a shelf of gunpowder. The gunpowder ignites. The fire, through the ignition hole, sets off the charge in the barrel. The bullet flies. Simple, reliable. These weapons were made in the 17th century by craftsmen who didn't know the word physics, so a blacksmith from Greystone could do it too, if he were taught. Daniel sketches until the candle burns out. Then he collapses onto the bed. The mattress smells musty. The ceiling is low. The wind howls outside the wall. He listens to the sea. The sea sounds the same in both worlds. He closes his eyes. Tomorrow the work begins. The first step, fuel for the forge. Without fire, there will be nothing. Peat from the marsh. Then coal. Burn wood. Then guano on the cliffs. Check for saltpeter. Then sulfur. Devin remembers hot springs 3 days' journey to the south. Volcanic ones. That means there's sulfur. The 3 components of gunpowder. Saltpeter, sulfur, coal. All 3 are available. This is no coincidence. It's a chance. The one and only. Daniel Rains falls asleep in a stranger's body on a stranger's bed in a strange world. He dreams of blueprints. Morning came with rain, light, cold, and endless. Daniel woke up when a raindrop fell on his forehead. The tarp on the roof was leaking. He sat up in bed and just breathed for a minute. The body still felt foreign. His legs still hurt, but his mind was working. That's what matters. He got dressed. His raincoat had been wet since the night before. His boots were tight. He went out to the square. Wade was already standing there. 17 men were with him, all different. 3 in chainmail, the remnants of the garrison. The rest in tattered shirts, convicts. One was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Another had a scar running from his ear to his chin. They looked at Daniel and saw a boy, lame, skinny, wearing a raincoat that cost more than all of them had ever earned in their entire lives. Daniel didn't make any speeches. Speeches are for those who have time. He didn't have time. He asked who knew how to work with wood. 2 raised their hands. He asked who had worked with stone. 1. Who knew how to weave ropes and nets? 4. Who had worked in a mine? Not a single one. Bad, but not fatal. He asked who could steer a boat in a storm. 8 out of 17. Greystone was a fishing town, and they knew the sea. Daniel said that everyone who worked would get food. 3 times a day. A roof over their heads. And a name. Not a nickname, not a number. A name. One of the convicts snorted. He asked why a nobleman was suddenly being so generous. Daniel replied that generosity had nothing to do with it. That in 6 months, the Tevran army would arrive here, and if they weren't ready, they'd all die. And that included him, because he was lame and had no magic, and in hand-to-hand combat, even a child could kill him. So he needed them, alive, well-fed, working, quiet. No one expected such honesty from an aristocrat. Aristocrats give orders. Aristocrats don't explain why. And certainly, aristocrats don't admit that they're weaker than everyone else in the room. The man missing 2 fingers asked what kind of work it was. Daniel said that, for starters, he needed peat. Lots of peat. There's a swamp beyond the eastern hill. Peat is fuel. Without fuel, there'll be no fire in the forge. Without a forge, there'll be no weapons. Without weapons, there will be nothing. A chain. As simple as a chain. Each link pulls the next. He sent 8 men to the swamp with instructions on how to cut the peat. He explained how deep to cut the layer and what size the pieces should be so they'd dry faster. He sent 3 men to the shore to gather driftwood, any tree the sea had washed ashore. He sent 2 men with Wade on a tour of the town to compile a complete inventory of property, and he sent 2 with him to the cliffs in the north, to the bird cliffs. The journey took an hour. His leg ached with every step. The trail wound upward over rocks wet from the rain. He slipped twice. The convicts offered no help. They walked behind him, no doubt thinking this lame fool would break his neck. But he didn't. He made it. The cliffs were white at the top. A thick layer of bird droppings covered the rock a meter deep, or maybe even more. Seagulls were screeching overhead. Hundreds of seagulls. Thousands. Daniel scooped up a handful of the white mass. He sniffed it. He crumbled it between his fingers. The texture was right. Dry layers at the bottom, moist ones on top. It was calcium nitrate. Not pure saltpeter, but close enough. With the right processing, soaking and filtering through ash, he'd get potassium nitrate. 75 parts saltpeter, 15 parts charcoal, 10 parts sulfur. Black powder. The oldest, simplest, and most reliable recipe in human history. And it all begins with this white mass on the cliffs of a forgotten peninsula. The convicts looked at him as if he were mad. A man stands knee-deep in bird droppings and smiles. Daniel said he needed people, 10 men every day, to gather this mass into sacks and carry it to the city. One of the convicts said it was just droppings, and that the nobles had completely lost their minds. Daniel replied that from these droppings he would make something that would make the walls of the Tevran fortresses. The convict didn't believe him, but he went back for the sacks. They returned around noon. The first chunks of peat brought from the swamp were already lying in the square. Wet, heavy. Daniel showed them how to lay them out to dry, in rows, with gaps, under a canopy if there was one. If not, then simply on the stones. The wind would do its job. Then he went to the blacksmith shop. Hollis was there, sitting on the same bench. But the forge had been tidied up a bit. The tools were put away. The old man had tidied up overnight. That meant he was thinking, that he hadn't made a decision yet but was already moving toward one. Daniel didn't press him. He sat down next to him, in silence. He took out the blueprints he'd been working on the night before. He laid them out on the workbench. Hollis glanced at them. Then he moved closer. Then he picked up one of the blueprints, a diagram of a flintlock. The old man stared at it for a long time. He ran his finger along the lines. He didn't understand what it was, but he understood that it had been drawn by someone who knew metal. The lines were precise. The dimensions were specified. The tolerances were marked. Hollis asked what kind of mechanism it was. Daniel explained. The flint strikes the steel. A spark falls on the gunpowder. The gunpowder ignites and propels a piece of lead through the barrel with tremendous force. The lead pierces wood. It pierces leather. It pierces chainmail. From a distance of 30 paces, Hollis said it sounded like magic. Daniel shook his head. He said that magic is when one person can kill another because they were born with a gift. But this is when anyone can defend themselves because someone built a tool for them. There's a difference. Hollis was silent. Then he asked about the promise, about the knife that cuts rope, about the device that pulls a person out of the water. Daniel pulled out another sketch, a simple hook with a spring mechanism and a rope loop. The principle is simple. You throw it into the water next to the drowning person. The hook catches on their clothes or belt. You pull. The spring locks the grip and prevents it from slipping off. Basic mechanics, not a shred of magic. Hollis stared at the sketch and his hands were shaking. It was the first thing he could do for his dead son. He couldn't save him, but he could make sure the next one didn't drown. He stood up. He walked over to the forge. He stood there for a moment. Then he turned to Daniel and said he needed charcoal. Good charcoal, not peat. You can't get a proper fire going in the forge with peat. Daniel nodded. He knew. That was the second problem in the chain. There were almost no trees on the peninsula, but there was driftwood, and it could be burned in a pit with limited air access. The charcoal would be lousy, uneven, but it would be enough for the time being. He explained to Hollis the principle of charcoal production in a closed pit. The old man listened. He nodded. He knew some of it, but he'd never done it himself. He'd always bought coal from traders on the mainland. There were no more traders. Greystone was cut off, so they'd have to make it themselves. By evening, Daniel had organized 3 groups. The first was the peat group. 10 men cut peat every day. The second was the bird guano group. 8 men collected guano. The third was the wood group. 5 men gathered driftwood and burn it in charcoal pits. Wade brought a list of supplies. Daniel read it by candlelight, and every line was a blow. Enough grain for 2 months. If we conserve, maybe 3. There's enough fish, but only until the sea freezes over. Not enough salt. No meat. Livestock, 4 goats and 1 old mule. Metal. Daniel ran his finger along the line. 12 rusty swords, 3 axes, a scattering of nails, and 1 old bombard without a carriage. Broken, rusty, abandoned in the shed. Daniel reread that line twice. A bombard, an old siege cannon, useless as it was, but metal, steel or cast iron, a cannon. He could cut it into pieces, or use it as is for a first prototype. It was like finding a gold nugget in a manure pile. He stood up and walked toward the shed. Night, rain, his leg. Who cares? The shed was at the end of the street. The door hung on a single hinge. It was dark inside. He lit a candle stub, and he saw it. The bombard lay on its side in the corner, 1.5 meters long. Rusty on the outside, but when he tapped it with his fingernail, the sound was clear. The metal was intact. The walls were thick. The caliber, he estimated it by eye, 3 inches, maybe a little more. This pipe could be made into a barrel, crooked, rough, but it would work. Or he could cut it up and get blanks for several gun barrels. He ran his hand over the cold metal. This world knew guns, primitive ones, capricious ones, but it knew them, so the idea of firearms wouldn't be entirely foreign. That meant gunpowder existed here. They just hadn't developed it, didn't understand it, didn't bring it to fruition. Because why bother when there are mages? Mages had made gunpowder unnecessary, and what's unnecessary is not developed. That is the magical world's greatest mistake. They halted progress. They froze it. And now an engineer from the 21st century stands in their shed, looking at a rusty pipe that will be the first step toward a revolution. Daniel returned home. He jotted down everything he needed for tomorrow. He lay down. He fell asleep instantly. His body was tired. His mind was not. Day 3. The forge was up and running by noon. Hollis stoked the bellows with charred tinder. The fire was weak, uneven, but it was burning. Daniel brought a scrap of steel rod from the junk in the forge and a piece of an old bombard that they'd sawed off that morning. A handsaw. 2 hours of work. Their hands were covered in blisters. But a piece of pipe, an elbow's length long, lay on the anvil. He told Hollis that they were about to assemble a contraption that would change the world. The old man grunted, but he picked up the hammer. 4 hours. Daniel explained every step, every blow, every bend. A flintlock, the simplest design. A trigger with a flint clamped in place. A steel plate on a spring. A powder chamber. A firing hole. A barrel made from a piece of bombard. A stock made from a scrap of driftwood, nailed together with staples. Crooked, rough, ugly. But it was a pistol. The first firearm in Greystone. The first firearm designed by a man who knew what the perfect Colt would look like after 400 years of evolution. Daniel loaded it. A pinch of gunpowder from a dismantled firework found in the town clerk's storeroom. A round lead bullet cast in a kitchen spoon. A wad made from a scrap of leather. They went out into the yard. Hollis was standing in the doorway of the smithy. More people had gathered at the sound of the commotion. The village headman, 2 convicts, a woman holding a child. Daniel took aim at an old shield nailed to the wall of the shed. 20 paces. His hands didn't tremble. These were his hands, the hands of an engineer. Maybe in this body they are thin and weak, but they know what they're doing. He pulled the trigger. A crash. Smoke. The recoil jolted his wrist. The shield shattered into splinters where the bullet struck. A hole right through the 2-finger-thick oak plank. Silence. Absolute silence. Then the woman pressed the child to her chest and took a step back. The village head stood there, pale as a sheet. Hollis stood there, pale as a sheet. Everyone stood there staring at the hole in the shield. They didn't understand what it was. Not magic, not an element, not the power of blood. Just a piece of lead that had flown out of an iron pipe and pierced the wood. Anyone could have pulled that trigger. Any fisherman, any convict, any woman. That was the point. Daniel turned to Hollis. Smoke still hung in the air. It smelled of sulfur and burning. On the 4th day, Daniel woke up to a knock on the door. Wade. The captain stood in the doorway with a look on his face that didn't bode well. He said that 3 convicts from the peat crew had left during the night. They'd taken a sack of grain and vanished. Daniel sat up in bed. He rubbed his face. He asked where they might have gone. Wade shrugged. The peninsula. There's only one road south to the mainland, across the isthmus. There are no other routes. Daniel said there was no need to look for them. Wade raised an eyebrow. Daniel repeated himself. Don't bother. They left because they don't believe anything will change here. Bringing them back by force means getting 3 saboteurs instead of 3 deserters. Let them go. The sack of grain is a loss, but an enemy within the walls is a greater loss. Wade looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Something like surprise flashed in his eyes. Aristocrats don't forgive desertion. Aristocrats hang people for stealing grain. And this young man simply let them go. Daniel stepped out onto the square. It wasn't raining. For the first time in 3 days, the sky had brightened slightly. The work continued. The peat digging crew had dwindled, but the others had arrived. The bird team brought the first sacks of guano. The stench was terrible. Daniel ordered the sacks to be stored in an empty shed on the outskirts and began preparing the first soaking pit. The principle is simple. The guano is doused with water. It is left to steep. It's filtered through layers of ash and straw. It crystallizes. The result is dirty but usable saltpeter. It's a long process. It takes about 3 weeks to get the first batch. But it had begun. That afternoon, he stopped by the blacksmith shop. Hollis was working. The bellows were humming. The old man was forging staples to repair the pier. Simple work, but his hands were moving. The blacksmith had come back to life. A young woman stood beside him, tall, broad-shouldered. Her wheat-colored braid was tucked under a headscarf. Her forearms were marked by old scars. She handed Hollis the pieces of metal and pumped the bellows. Eleanor, the blacksmith's daughter. Daniel remembered from someone else's memory that she had stopped speaking after her brother's death. But here, by the forge, she was working. Silently, without a single word. But she was working. Hollis introduced her. He said his daughter was helping. Eleanor looked at Daniel. Gray eyes, a heavy gaze. She didn't bow. She didn't lower her head. She just looked at him and turned away to the furs. Daniel didn't press the issue. He laid out the blueprints on the workbench. Hollis approached. Daniel showed him the new blueprint, a full-size flintlock rifle. Not a pistol, a barrel as long as an arm, a stock, a sight rail. The action was the same type but larger and more reliable. He explained that they needed 10 of these, all the same caliber, all the same size, all identical. Hollis asked why they had to be identical. Wouldn't it be better to customize each one for the shooter? Daniel shook his head. Standardization, the key word he had brought into this world. If every rifle has its own caliber, then each needs its own bullet, its own measure of gunpowder, its own cartridge case. In battle, there's no time to figure out which bullet belongs to which barrel. One bullet, one caliber, one measure. Any shooter can pick up any rifle and fire. If one falls, the next picks up his weapon and carries on. Hollis listened and nodded slowly. He was a master. He understood the beauty of simplicity. Eleanor was listening too. Daniel noticed that she had turned toward the workbench and was looking at the blueprints. Not at him, at the blueprints. Her gaze glided over the lines as if along a familiar path. She raised a finger and tapped the spot where the barrel joined the receiver. She looked at her father. Hollis nodded. He said his daughter was right. The joint was weak. It needed a reinforced coupling. Daniel looked at the drawing, then at Eleanor. She was right. He'd seen it himself but had wanted to simplify the design. But the joint really was weak. With frequent firing, it would come loose. He said he'd fix it. Eleanor turned her attention back to the mechanisms, but something flashed in her eyes. Not interest, not distrust, just surprise that someone had accepted her observation without argument. On the 5th day, Daniel called a meeting. If you could call a meeting of 4 people sitting at a table in his stone box. Wade, Hollis, Elder Gale, and Daniel. He laid out a hand-drawn map of the peninsula in front of them. Greystone, the isthmus, the cliffs to the north, the swamp to the east, the coast to the west, the southern passage. The only route to the mainland was via the isthmus, 300 paces wide. Daniel pointed to the isthmus. He said it was the neck of the bottle, a bottleneck. Any army marching on Greystone would have to pass through it. There was no other way. It was possible to go around by sea, but that would require a fleet. The Tevrans had no fleet on this shore. So, the isthmus. Wade nodded. He knew that. He'd known for 20 years that the isthmus was the only advantage of this position. But without walls, without a garrison, and without mages, the isthmus was worthless. Daniel said that walls weren't needed. Wade choked. Daniel repeated himself. We don't need walls. We need positions. He sketched on the map 3 lines of trenches across the isthmus at varying depths. First line, infantry, shallow trenches for riflemen. Second line, main line, deeper, with cover for reloading. Third line, artillery, for when we have guns. In front of the first line, the field, open, flat, within firing range. Anyone who sets foot on this field will come under fire from all 3 lines at once. Wade stared at the map. He didn't understand. He'd been fighting for 20 years by the rules of this world. A wall, a gate, a mage in a tower, knights charging. What Daniel was drawing was something completely different. It wasn't a fortress. It was a trap. Daniel explained. A wall protects against swords and arrows, but not against magic. A battle mage could destroy the wall in 5 minutes, but a moat 1.5 meters deep can't be destroyed. It's already in the ground. An archer in a trench is invisible until the enemy gets within firing range. And by the time they do, it'll be too late. Wade shook his head. He said it was madness. That normal people build walls. That his grandfather built walls. That's how wars are fought. Daniel said that was exactly why everyone loses. Silence. Wade bristled. Gale shifted nervously. Hollis remained silent. Daniel realized he'd gone too far. You can't break a man over your knee, especially an old soldier. He said that Captain Wade knew war better than he did. That's true. That he himself had never wielded a sword or stood in formation. That was true too. But he knew something else. He knew how to ensure that a man wouldn't have to stand in formation. How a fisherman could kill a knight without coming within 100 paces of him, and that if Captain Wade gave him a month, he would prove it. Wade asked how he would prove it. Daniel said that in a month, 10 fishermen with guns would defeat 10 soldiers with swords in a mock battle, without a single scratch. Wade snorted, but he accepted. In a month. It was a challenge that spoke a language the old soldier understood. The meeting ended. Gale left, muttering about madness. Wade left in silence. Hollis lingered. He looked at Daniel. He said the guy was playing with fire. Daniel smiled. He replied that fire was his specialty. On the 6th day, food problems began. Not a catastrophe, but there was less grain than he'd expected. Mice had gotten into one of the sacks. The fishermen returned from the sea with half their usual catch. The season was changing. The fish were moving deeper. The nets were old and tearing. Daniel sat poring over his calculations. 2,000 people. Enough grain for 2.5 months. Fish were unpredictable. The only meat was goat, and even then, only if they slaughtered one. But they couldn't slaughter the goats. The goats provided milk for the children. He remembered the seaweed. Devin had a vague memory of seaweed on the western shore, lorgan, brown strands. The locals didn't eat it. They considered it trash. But Daniel knew that brown seaweed was edible. It was low in calories but contained iodine and minerals. It could be dried. It could be added to soup. Not a delicacy, but people wouldn't die. He sent a group to the west shore to gather seaweed. He explained how to dry it and how to cook it. People grumbled. Seaweed wasn't food. Seaweed is what you feed pigs. But there were no pigs, and there was hunger. By the end of the first week in Greystone, a routine had settled in. Morning. Groups split up to tackle their tasks. Peat, guano, coal, seaweed, boat repairs, the blacksmith shop. Evening. The groups returned. A communal meal from a single cauldron. Daniel insisted that everyone cook together, not in their individual homes. One communal cauldron in the square. It saved firewood. It saved food. And it did something else as well. People who eat together begin to feel like a community. He didn't learn this from books. He learned it from the factory cafeteria in Hartford. A team starts with a shared table. By the 8th day, he began selecting marksmen. He needed 15 people, not the strongest, not the bravest, the most patient. Shooting isn't about strength. Shooting is about repetition. One movement, over and over again, until the body remembers. He asked Wade to round up volunteers. 22 people showed up, fishermen, convicts, an old man from the garrison, and one girl, a redhead, freckled, defiant eyes. She stood among the men and looked at Daniel defiantly. Maggie Doe, a fisherman's daughter. Daniel didn't argue about whether a woman should shoot. In his world, female snipers in the Red Army were taking out the Germans on the Eastern Front. Gender has nothing to do with marksmanship. He handed out the sticks, long, straight sticks. He explained that until they had rifles, they would practice with sticks. Form up, command, aim, fire, reload. Everything on command, everything at once. A volley. Not a single shot, a volley. 20 barrels fire simultaneously. Then reload. Then a second volley. Then a third. Reload speed is everything. Whoever reloads faster will survive. Wade stood to the side and watched. His face was expressionless, but he was watching. Daniel began training them. The first day was a nightmare. The fishermen didn't understand why they had to line up, why they had to do everything at the same time, why they had to listen to a command instead of just shooting when they saw the enemy. Daniel explained patiently. A single shot might miss. 20 simultaneous shots would cover the area. The enemy couldn't dodge 20 bullets. Not even a mage can dodge them, because they don't know where the bullets are coming from. Maggie Doe listened more attentively than anyone else. She stood in formation and repeated every movement on the first try. Aim, fire, reload. Her hands were quick and precise, the hands of someone who had spent their whole life knitting nets and hauling ropes. A fisherman's fine motor skills, perfect for a marksman. Daniel took note of her to himself. By the end of the second week, the guano pits yielded their first results. After filtration, the murky liquid began to crystallize. Dirty gray crystals settled at the bottom of the wooden vat. Not pure saltpeter, but usable. Daniel gathered the crystals. He weighed them on his homemade scales, about a pound. Not much. But the process works, if scaled up. If he set up 5 pits instead of 1, if he organized a continuous cycle. He did the math. In 3 weeks, he'd have enough saltpeter for the first batch of gunpowder. No sulfur yet, but he sent 2 convicts south to the hot springs. If Devin's memory serves him right, there are yellow deposits around the geysers there, elemental sulfur. All that's left is to wait. He stood on a cliff that evening, gazing out at the sea. Sunset, red. The clouds had parted for the first time in a week. Below, the coal pits were smoldering. Seaweed was drying on the shore. A fire was burning in the forge. 2 days ago, Hollis had finished the first part of the flintlock mechanism for the rifle, the spring. On the 15th day, 2 convicts returned from the south. They brought 2 sacks, heavy ones. Daniel untied the first one and saw yellow lumps. Sulfur. Pure volcanic sulfur from deposits around the hot springs. He held a piece up to his nose. The smell of rotten eggs, familiar from the factory laboratories. The second sack was half empty. A convict named Reed explained that the road was rough and they couldn't carry any more. But there was plenty of sulfur there, entire deposits around the geysers. Daniel nodded. He made a mental note. He needed a regular route. Send a group out once every 2 weeks. 4 people. 2 sacks of sulfur per trip. That would be enough. Now he had everything. Nitrate from guano. The first batch was dirty but usable. Sulfur from the south. Coal from burnt fin. 3 components. 75, 15, 10. He shut himself in his house. He laid out 3 piles on the table. White crystals, yellow lumps, black charcoal. The saltpeter had to be ground into a powder, the sulfur too. The charcoal was already crumbly. He worked with the mortar for 3 hours. Then he began mixing, carefully, in batches. He stirred the mixture with a wooden stick, not a metal one. Metal could produce a spark. A spark in this mixture would mean 1 less lord for Greystone. The first batch turned out gray and lumpy. He knew it was weak. The composition was approximate. The grinding was uneven. Gunpowder requires granulation. He needed to moisten the mixture with alcohol or water, sift it through a sieve and dry it. Granules burn evenly. Powder burns in bursts. But it would do for a test. He went out into the courtyard. He sprinkled a pinch onto a stone. He held a smoldering splinter to it, a flash, white smoke, a hiss. The stone turned black. It works. The gunpowder works. That moment was worth all 14 days of filth, cold, and pain in his leg. 4 centuries of the gunpowder revolution had begun in his world with a similar flash in a monastery laboratory. And now it had happened again on a windswept rock at the edge of a foreign world. Daniel stood and stared at the black spot on the stone. Then he went to the smithy. In 2 weeks, Hollis had made 3 flintlocks. The first was rough, the second was better. The third already worked like clockwork. The flint struck the steel cleanly. The spark fell reliably onto the shelf. The old man was a quick learner. His hands remembered the metal, and each new flintlock emerged from under the hammer smoother than the one before. Eleanor worked nearby. She was still silent, but now she was making barrels. Daniel had shown her how to drill a bore through a steel rod. The tool was primitive, a hand drill with a crank. It was hard work. It took an hour per barrel, but she did it with astonishing precision. Her hands had a feel for the metal. She knew when to press harder and when to ease up, when the drill was going crooked and when it was going straight. Daniel realized that in another world, she would have been an engineer or a surgeon. Here, she was a blacksmith's daughter, and that was the best thing Greystone could offer him. By the 20th day, they had 6 guns, not 10 as he'd planned, but 6, all the same caliber. Barrels a hand's length long, stocks made of driftwood, flintlocks, rough but functional, each one tested, each one fired. Daniel began training the shooters with real weapons. Gunpowder was scarce, every shot counted. So he allowed 3 shots per person per day. 3 shots. Load, take aim, fire, remember, repeat. Maggie Doe hit the target on her first shot, 30 paces out, right in the center of the barrel. Daniel watched and nodded silently. He'd seen people like that at the shooting range in Hartford. Natural-born shooters. They don't need to learn how to aim. They sense the trajectory just as a fish senses the current. Wade was watching too. His expression began to change. Not belief yet, but his skepticism was crumbling. He saw a lead bullet pierce a board from a distance at which an archer is only just drawing the bowstring. He saw a fisherwoman who had never held a sword before place a bullet right in the center of the target. And he began to understand. On the 22nd day, the first accident happened. One of the shooters, a man named Bart, a former smuggler, loaded his gun incorrectly. A double charge of gunpowder. The barrel exploded. It sliced open Bart's cheek and burned his hand. He was screaming. Blood was flowing. People rushed over. Wade ran up with his sword, thinking it was an attack. Daniel was the first to reach him. He examined the wound. The cheek was cut, but not deeply. The hand was burned, but the fingers were moving. He'll live. He bandaged Bart with a scrap of clean cloth. Then he gathered all the shooters. He showed them the ruptured barrel. He said it happened because Bart had poured gunpowder by eye, not the right measure. A gun doesn't forgive mistakes. It's not like a sword. A sword is blunt. It doesn't do anything. A gun loaded incorrectly kills its owner. Therefore, rule number 1, use only a measuring spoon for gunpowder. Rule number 2, check the barrel before loading. Rule number 3, if in doubt, ask. It's better to look like a fool than to lose an arm. The marksman listened. Bart listened with his cheek bandaged. The accident scared everyone. But it also did something important. People realized this wasn't a toy, not a trick by some visiting lord. It was a real weapon, dangerous, powerful, demanding respect and discipline. And that turned fishermen with fishing rods into something resembling soldiers. After the accident, Daniel introduced a new rule. Every rifle was assigned a number, burned into the stock. Each shooter was assigned to his own number. He was responsible for his rifle. He cleaned it. He checked it. He knew every scratch on it. A rifle isn't communal property. A rifle is a part of you. Maggie stroked her .22 as if it were a living creature. She had already hit targets at 40 paces, and at 50. Her eye was incredible. Daniel began training her separately, not in volley fire but in precision shooting. One-on-one, one shot, one target. Maggie asked why she needed to shoot individually if a volley was more effective. Daniel replied that volleys were for infantry, and she wasn't infantry. She was something more important. She didn't understand. He'd explain later. When they had rifled barrels, when the range tripled, then she'd understand. On the 25th day, Daniel turned his attention to another problem. Food. The grain was melting away. The fish weren't biting. Seaweed sustained them but didn't feed them. He looked at the map and thought, trade. Greystone could trade. But with what? They had nothing, except for one thing, Salt. Sea salt. He'd seen puddles left behind by the tide on the shore. The water evaporated in the wind, leaving a white crust on the rocks. Salt. In this world, salt was prized. Not like gold, but close. Every city bought salt. Every caravan carried salt. And Greystone stood in the middle of a sea of salt, yet no one had thought to harvest it. He set up a salt works, a primitive one. Stone troughs on the shore. Seawater poured in. The wind and the meager sun did the work. A week later, he harvested the first crystals. White, large, sea salt. He sent Reed off with 2 sacks of salt and a note to the nearest port, a 2-day journey away, to trade for grain and iron. Any iron. Bars, strips, scraps, anything. Reed returned 5 days later with a sack of grain and 3 strips of wrought iron. The merchant at the port didn't believe they made salt at Greystone, but he gave it a try, and he bought it. Daniel took the strips of iron. He turned them over in his hands. The quality was average, lots of impurities, but it could be reforged. It could be purified. It could be made into barrels. This was the second source of metal after the bombarda, and it was renewable. Salt in exchange for iron. The sea in exchange for weapons. A beautiful cycle. He smiled. Eleanor noticed. She now noticed his smiles. Rare, fleeting, always to the point. He smiled when something worked, when a cog fell into place, when the chain closed. An engineer's smile. She didn't know what it was called yet, but she recognized it every time. By the 30th day, Daniel had done the math. 8 flintlock guns, a pound of gunpowder, 200 bullets, 20 shooters, 15 of whom could hit a barrel from 30 paces. 1 sniper who could hit a barrel from 60. The coal pits were operational. The saltpeter pits are yielding a steady output. The salt works are producing iron. The dock has been repaired. 3 boats are in the water. Food, still on the edge, but not over the edge. People aren't starving. They eat sparingly, but every day. The communal pot is working. A rhythm has settled in. Greystone was beginning to move, slowly, with difficulty, like an old machine whose rusty gears had been lubricated. But it was moving. Wade came to him on the evening of the 30th day. He reminded him of the promise. 1 month, 10 archers against 10 swordsmen. Daniel nodded. Tomorrow, at the isthmus. Morning of the 31st day. The isthmus. 300 paces wide between the cliffs. To the left, a sheer drop to the sea. To the right, a swamp. A narrow bottleneck. An ideal defensive position. Daniel stood on a rise and looked down. 2 groups were lined up on the isthmus. On the left, 10 riflemen with rifles. Maggie Doe was first in line. Next to her was Bart, his cheek now healed. Next to them were 8 more fishermen and convicts. On the right were 10 swordsmen, Wade's veteran garrison soldiers. Old, tough. They knew how to wield a sword. They knew how to form a line. They knew how to attack. The rifles were loaded with wooden bullets wrapped in rags. They wouldn't kill, but they'd leave a bruise. The swords were blunted and wrapped in leather. Same conditions. Painful, but not fatal. Daniel explained the rules. The swordsmen stood at one end of the isthmus, the archers at the other. The distance was 200 paces. The swordsmen attacked. The archers fired. Whoever was struck by a wooden bullet was dead. Whoever was struck by a sword was also dead. It was simple. Wade stood with the swordsman. He wanted to see it for himself. He wanted to show the boy that walls and swords worked, that 1,000 years of war had not been wrong. Daniel raised his hand, lowered it. It began. The swordsman moved forward, in formation, shields raised, 1 step, another step. They moved as they'd been taught, shoulder to shoulder, a wall of shields, invulnerable to arrows at this distance. The archers stood, waiting. Maggie looked through the sight. 200 paces, too far for a flintlock. 150, still too far. 100, right on the edge. Daniel told them to wait. The archers waited. 80 paces. The swordsmen picked up their pace. They sensed that the attack was about to begin and wanted to close the distance faster. 60 paces. Daniel gave the command. First line, fire! 5 archers fired simultaneously. A roar, smoke. 5 wooden bullets struck the line of swordsmen. 2 hit their shields. 1 whistled past. 2 struck their bodies. 1 swordsman doubled over from a blow to the stomach. A second was hit in the shoulder and dropped his shield. 2 out of 10. The swordsmen lost their rhythm. They hadn't expected it to be so loud, or the smoke so thick, or the impact so strong. Even a wooden bullet from 60 paces away hit like a fist. Daniel gave the command to the second line. The first line reloaded. Second line, fire! 5 more shots. 2 more swordsmen were taken out. 1 took a bullet in the thigh and fell. The second was hit in the chest and sank to the ground, gasping for air. 4 out of 10. In 2 minutes. The swordsman hadn't even covered half the distance. The first line had reloaded. Daniel gave the command again. Fire! 5 more. 6 out of 10 in 3 volleys. The remaining 4 ran. Not out of fear, out of realization. They realized they wouldn't make it. That in 40 paces another volley would meet them. And another. And another. That running with a sword against rifles across an open field wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Wade stood among the killed. A wooden bullet had struck his breastplate during the second volley. He stood there, breathing heavily. He looked at the shooters. 10 fishermen. 10 former nobodies. With wooden stocks and flintlocks. They had just wiped out 10 trained swordsmen without letting them get closer than 40 paces. Not a single marksman had suffered so much as a scratch. Wade approached Daniel. He was silent for a long time. Then he said he wanted to learn how to shoot. Daniel replied that shooting wasn't necessary for him. He needed to learn how to command archers, because archers without a commander are just a mob with sticks. But archers with a commander who knows war are an army. Wade understood war. He'd served in the ranks for 20 years. He knew flanks and rear guards and reserves and maneuvers. He just needed to transfer that knowledge to a new tool, like transposing a song from a lute to an organ. The notes are the same. The sound is different. Wade nodded, slowly, heavily. 20 years of habits were crumbling in his head. But he was a soldier, and a soldier accepts reality, even if that reality fires wooden bullets. From that day on, Wade became second in command to Daniel in the Greystone chain of command. Not as garrison captain, as commander of a rifle company. 20 men, 8 rifles for now, the rest with sticks. But everyone is learning. Wade began setting up a training ground on the isthmus, targets at various distances, firing positions, trenches for cover. He didn't quite believe it yet, but he started building. And that's more important than belief. On the 33rd day, the first outsider arrived in Greystone, a boat from a fishing village half a day's journey along the coast. A man in the boat, middle-aged, bearded, hands of a craftsman. He said he'd heard about the strange lord at Greystone who pays for work with food, and that he was a leather worker. He knew how to tan hides and sew. Daniel hired him on the spot. Leather was needed for belts, for bandages, for gun cases, for aprons in the blacksmith shop, for 100 little things without which production grinds to a halt. The tanner's name was Murph. He was quiet, hard-working, and asked few questions. The ideal worker. Daniel set him up with a workshop in an empty house by the pier and gave him his first order. 20 identical belts with loops for powder flasks. Murph looked at the sample. He nodded. He went to work. By evening, he brought 3 finished belts, all identical. Neat work. Daniel began to realize something important. Greystone was no longer a prison. Greystone was becoming a place where people came of their own accord. Because there was work here, there was food, there was order, and there was a man who told him he was needed. On the 35th day, Daniel went down into the basement of the old lighthouse. The lighthouse stood on a cape north of the city. Old, stone, abandoned. The light had long since gone out. No one had gone up there in years. But Daniel didn't need the light. He needed the basement. Davin recalled that the lighthouse had been used as a storage facility back when the previous lord was in charge, and that the basement there was dry. He wanted to set up a gunpowder storehouse, a dry, cool place far from residential buildings, safe. He descended the stone steps. It was dark. Contrary to his expectations, it was damp, but not on the floor. The walls were dry. The ceiling was dry. Water had pooled only at the entrance, where the stones had settled. That could be fixed. He lit a torch and surveyed the cellar. It was empty, almost. In the far corner stood a pile of junk, old barrels, rotten planks, scraps of chains, and behind the barrels, a chest, small, iron-bound. The lock was broken, but the lid was heavy. He opened it. Inside lay a notebook. The leather cover was cracked and darkened by time. The pages were yellow, fragile. He brought the torch closer and opened the first page. The letters leapt out at him. English, Old English, handwritten text. The ink had faded but was still legible. His hands trembled. He knew this language. Not Davin, Daniel. He began to read. My name is Edward Castle. I am a weaver from Manchester. I do not know how I came to be in this place and in this body. His heart stopped. Then it began to beat twice as fast. He read on, page after page. Castle had ended up here roughly 200 years ago, according to the local calendar, the 1790s. He had been a weaver. He knew the mechanics of looms. He had found himself in the body of a peasant boy, not an aristocrat, just an ordinary boy. Nameless, without connections, he survived. He built a new type of loom. He established the production of fine cloth. He became famous. He attracted attention, and he attracted the attention of the church. The entries grew more hurried toward the end. The letters were larger. The ink was thicker. Fear seeped through the pages. Castle wrote that the priests came with questions about his knowledge, about his memory, about how a weaver could know things that no master in the kingdom knew. He tried to hide. It didn't help. The last pages were torn, crumpled. The handwriting was shaky. The final entry broke off mid-sentence. They didn't come for the loom. They came for what I remember about gunpowder. Someone here knows about us. Someone here is looking for us. Daniel sat in the lighthouse basement with a notebook on his lap. The torch crackled. Shadows danced on the walls. He's not the first. He isn't the only one. There was someone before him, a weaver from Manchester, a man from his world. And that man perished, burned at the stake by the church, in the year 1798 according to the local calendar, for knowing too much, for remembering what he shouldn't have. But Castle wrote something else. Someone here knows. Someone is searching. This meant that Daniel's exile to Greystone was no accident. Someone at court knew, or suspected, that Davin von Westmark had changed, that someone else was now inside his body, and that someone had sent him here, not to die, but to watch, to observe what would grow, an experiment. He felt a chill, not from the stone, but from the realization. He was a pawn, not a discarded piece, but one placed on the board deliberately. He's playing the long game, someone who, 200 years ago, was watching Edward Castle, and who is now watching him. Daniel closed the notebook. He hid it back in the chest. He pushed the chest behind the barrels. He left the basement. He climbed up to the cape. The wind blew in his face. The sea below roared. He stood there and thought. Facts. First, he isn't the only one who's ended up here. Second, someone in this world knows about the time travelers. Third, that someone holds a high position because they were able to arrange for the Duke's son to be exiled. Fourth, the church killed Castle, but someone set the church on Castle's trail. Or didn't. Or couldn't protect him. Fifth, Castle's last entry mentions gunpowder. Castle wasn't a gunsmith, he was a weaver, but he knew what gunpowder was. Anyone from their world knows, and someone here wanted that knowledge. So gunpowder isn't just needed by Daniel, someone else needs it too. Someone sitting in the shadows, waiting. And that someone brought him here, chose him, the weapons engineer. It was no accident. Daniel came down from the Cape. He headed back toward the city. His leg hurt more than usual. The cold crept under his cloak. But his mind was clear. He knew what to do. The same thing as before. Guns, gunpowder, people. Walls aren't needed. Barrels are needed. But now he knew something else. He wasn't just building a fortress. He was playing someone else's game. And if he wanted to survive, he needed to figure out whose. He returned to town. Wade was waiting with a report. 2 new guns were ready. That made 10 in total. Gunpowder for 500 shots. The saltpeter pits were operating at full capacity. Sora. Daniel stopped. Sora? He didn't know that name. Wade explained. A woman. Young. She'd come from the south 2 days ago. Petite, with a burn on her cheek. She asked for refuge. She said she'd been sentenced to be burned at the stake for unauthorized experiments. An alchemist. Daniel went to see her. She was sitting against the wall in an empty barracks, huddled, wary, short, dark hair, a burn on her right cheek from an old chemical reaction, thin, wiry, eyes sharp as knives. Daniel sat down across from her. He asked what she knew how to do. She was silent. She looked at him. She sized him up. Then she said she knew how to do things for which people are killed. Daniel said that in Greystone, people aren't killed for knowledge. She snorted. She said that's what everyone says. He asked if she knew what saltpeter was. Her eyes narrowed. She replied that she knew. And she knew about sulfur, and about volatile oils, and about acids. Daniel nodded. He said he would build a laboratory for her, with a fume hood, with instruments, with a safe for hazardous substances. A real laboratory, not a basement, not a storage closet. A place where her work wouldn't be hidden away but would be valued. Sora Choi looked at him and didn't believe a single word. But she didn't leave, because she had nowhere else to go. Sora didn't trust him for 3 days. She sat in the barracks and only went out to eat. Daniel didn't pressure her. He kept building. On the 4th day after her arrival, the laboratory was ready. An empty stone house by the city's eastern wall. Daniel had chosen it because the wind from the sea blew away from the residential neighborhoods. If something exploded or caught fire, only the rock would be damaged. Hollis forged an iron door. Eleanor made a ventilation pipe out of sheet metal. Reed and 2 convicts a stone table in the center of the room and shelves along the walls. Daniel drew up a diagram of the exhaust system, a simple one. A pipe from the table to the ceiling and out through the roof. The draft was created by the temperature difference. Not perfect, but better than nothing. He asked Hollis to forge a sign for the door. Master Choi's Laboratory. The letters were rough and a bit crooked, but legible. He brought Sora in. She walked in silently, skeptically. She went inside. She saw the table, the shelves, and the exhaust system. Stone mortars and pestles, clay vessels for reagents, a wooden safe with a lock for hazardous substances. Not a real safe, of course, but a sturdy box with a padlock. Better than nothing in a world without steel. Then she saw the sign on the door. She stood there and looked at it. For a long time, in silence. Daniel was waiting behind her. She turned to face him. Her eyes were shining, but her voice was steady. She asked what he wanted from her. Daniel replied, "Gunpowder. Consistent quality. Consistent from batch to batch. No surprises. No misfires. No explosions during storage." She could do it better than he could because she was a chemist and he was an engineer. He knew the formula. She knew the substances. Together, they would create something the world had never seen. Sora asked, "And then what?" "After the gunpowder," Daniel said, "then the primers. Mercury fulminate, a percussion charge. Substances that explode on impact, not from a spark. That's the next step. Without caps, there'll be no revolver. Without a revolver, there'll be no rapid-fire weapon. And without a rapid-fire weapon, they won't survive the coming year." Sora listened. For the first time during their conversation, Something appeared in her eyes, something other than distrust. Interest. Professional interest. She asked about fulminate of mercury. How did he know the formula? Daniel said he knew it. He didn't explain where he got it from. Not now. Sora nodded. Not because she believed him, but because she wanted to check. She took off her travel bag, hung it on a hook, and got to work. On the very first day, she went through his saltpeter. She sniffed it, tasted it on her tongue, rubbed it between her fingers, and said it was crap. Literally and figuratively. Too many organic impurities. The crystallization was rough. Gunpowder made from this would burn unevenly and misfire every other shot. Daniel wasn't offended. He knew she was right. His filtration method was primitive. Sora explained how to do it better. Double filtration through the ash of 2 different types of rock, then recrystallization, then drying at a specific temperature, no higher and no lower. This was a level of expertise Daniel wasn't familiar with. His knowledge of gunpowder was engineering-based, the recipe, proportions, and application. Her knowledge was chemical, reaction molecules, and purity. Together, they covered everything. By the 40th day, Sora had produced the first batch of gunpowder of their own making. Daniel loaded the rifle and fired. The difference was like that between moonshine and factory-bottled vodka. Pure bang. White smoke instead of black. The recoil was smooth. The bullet traveled 10 paces farther than usual. Sora stood nearby and watched. She wasn't smiling, but her shoulders straightened slightly. For the first time ever in Greystone, she stood up straight. Daniel said it was the best gunpowder in the world. She replied that it was mediocre and that in 2 weeks she'd make the real thing. He smiled. She didn't. But the corner of her mouth twitched. By the 45th day in Greystone, there were 15 rifles. Gunpowder of consistent quality, 30 trained shooters. Wade put them through their paces every day. A volley. Reload. A volley. He devised a rotation system. 2 lines. The first fires. The second reloads. Then they switched places. Continuous fire. Daniel didn't prompt him. Wade figured it out on his own. 18th century linear tactics were being reborn in the mind of a man who had never heard of Frederick the Great. It was beautiful. As beautiful as a drawing that draws itself. Eleanor made the barrels, one after another, each straighter than the last. She stopped keeping silent. Not entirely. She spoke little, but she spoke. With her father, with Daniel. Once she asked why he limped. Daniel said he'd fallen, a long time ago. She looked at his leg, then at his face. She said he was lying, but she didn't ask any further. She understood that people have things they don't talk about. She had those kinds of things too. On the 50th day, a storm came, a real winter storm. The wind tore off roofs. Waves crashed over the pier. The 3 boats they'd spent 2 weeks repairing were smashed against the rocks in a single night. In the morning, Daniel stood on the shore and looked at the wreckage. A month's work reduced to splinters in 10 hours. People stood behind him. They were silent. They were waiting. To hear what the Lord would say, what he would do. He turned to face them. He said that boats were made of wood. Wood breaks. They would build new ones, stronger ones, with a different keel shape, with double planking. He knew the design of the fishing dories from the New England coast. Simple, reliable. A wide bottom, high sides, stability in a storm. Hollis and the carpenters would build one in a week, then a second, then a third. The people listened. Some nodded, some didn't, but no one left. The storm brought something else as well. The waves washed the wreckage of a ship ashore, a large one. A merchant ship, judging by the logs and rigging. Wood, lots of wood. Planks, beams, a mast, ropes. Daniel saw this as a gift. He sent everyone ashore to gather everything. Every plank, every nail, every piece of rope. Wood was the biggest shortage in Greystone, and the sea had just washed up an entire ship in pieces for them. Among the wreckage they found a barrel, sealed, heavy. Inside was iron, strips of wrought iron for blacksmithing, apparently the cargo of the sunken ship. Hollis ran his fingers over the iron. He said the quality was good, better than what Reed had been bringing in from the port. Daniel said it was a sign. Hollis replied that it was just the storm, but he smiled. For the first time in all those weeks, the old man smiled. Eleanor saw the smile from O, and something inside her thawed a little. She looked at Daniel. He was standing knee-deep in the surf, pulling planks out of the water, limping, wet, skinny, not at all like a lord, more like a laborer, an engineer, a man of action. She walked over to him and stood silently beside him. Together they hauled the planks until evening, without speaking, without needing words. On the 55th day, the pirates came. Not an army, not a fleet. 3 boats, about 30 men with cutlasses and axes. They came to Greystone every fall. The fishermen knew. It was like a seasonal disaster, like a storm, like a famine. The pirates would come. They'd take whatever they could. Sometimes they'd kill. The fishermen would hide. They'd wait until they left. That's how it always was. This time it turned out differently. A lookout on the cliffs spotted the boats at dawn. He ran to Wade. Wade went to Daniel. 3 boats from the southwest, 30 men. They'd be off the shore in an hour. Daniel stood up. His leg ached from yesterday. Who cares? He told Wade to round up the marksmen, all of them, 20 with rifles. The rest, armed with pikes, to the reserve. Take up positions on the shore behind the rocks. Not in the open, behind cover. Wait until the pirates land and approach the town. Don't shoot until he says so. Wade nodded. He left. 15 minutes later, 20 riflemen were lying behind the rocks along the trail from the pier to the town. 12 with rifles, 8 with pikes in the second line. Maggie Doe lay on a rock higher than the rest, with rifle number 2. Her position gave her a view 100 paces along the trail. Daniel stood behind her on the hill, with a spyglass they'd found in the shipwreck. He could see the boats, closer, even closer. The pirates were confidently. They knew this place, knew there was nothing to fear here. The fishermen were hiding. The old men were praying. They could plunder in peace. The first boat bumped against the shore. The pirates leaped into the water. They hauled the boat ashore. The second, the third, 32 men. Daniel counted them. Cutlasses, axes, 2 short swords. Not a single bow, not a single shield. They walked along the path toward the town, in high spirits. One sang, another laughed. They didn't expect any resistance. They had never encountered resistance on Greystone. 50 paces from the ambush. 40. 30. Daniel raised his hand. Wade looked up at him. 20 paces. Daniel lowered his hand. Wade barked the command. 12 guns fired simultaneously. The roar through the cliffs. A cloud of smoke obscured the trail. When the smoke cleared slightly, Daniel saw 7 men lying on the ground. 7 out of 32 in a single volley. The rest froze. They didn't understand what had happened. Thunder, smoke, pain, people falling, magic. They decided it was magic. One of them screamed, reloading. Wade counted the seconds. 20 seconds. The gunsmiths were at work. Gunpowder, bullet, wad, ramrod, trigger. A second volley. 5 more fell. 12 out of 32. The remaining 20 ran. Back to the boats, along the trail. Maggie Doe fired from above, separately from the volley. Aimed. 1 shot. 1 pirate fell. Reload. Second shot. Second pirate. She worked like a metronome, calmly, precisely, without emotion. The pirates reached the shore. 17 out of 32. They pushed the boats together. They rowed, quickly, in terror, without looking back. It was all over in 4 minutes. 15 bodies lay on the trail. Daniel came down the hill, slowly, his leg. He approached the bodies. He looked. He felt sick. He'd seen targets. He'd seen barrels with holes in them. He'd never seen dead people with gunshot wounds. Blood. Lots of blood. Ragged wounds from round lead bullets. It wasn't clean. It wasn't pretty. It was disgusting. Necessary, but disgusting. He turned and walked behind a rock. He threw up. Wade came over. He stood beside him. He was silent. Then he said that the first battle is always like that. Daniel wiped his mouth. He nodded. He said they needed to bury the bodies. Wade raised an eyebrow. Pirates were usually left on the shore. Daniel repeated himself. Bury them. Everyone. They're people. They were people. Wade nodded. He gave the order. The shooters stood on the trail, rifles in hand. Their faces varied. Some were pale, some were trembling. Maggie stood calmly. Her face was blank, not cruel, just blank. She'd done her job. Just like she knitted nets. Just like she hauled ropes. Work. Daniel walked over to her. He asked how she was doing. Maggie looked at him. She replied that she was fine. Then she paused, and added that she was lying, that her hands were shaking. She was just holding them behind her back so no one would see. Daniel nodded. He said he'd thrown up too. Maggie looked at him in surprise. The Lord, the one who created these guns, the one who gave the order to shoot. He'd thrown up. She smiled slightly, sadly. She said he was a strange lord. Daniel replied that he wasn't a lord. He was an engineer. She didn't understand the word, but she understood the tone. That evening, Greystone went for a walk, if you could call a double portion of fish soup and a sip of juniper liqueur from the village elder's stash a walk. But people were smiling. For the first time. They'd fought back. No walls, no magic, no knights. Fishermen with guns had taken down 30 pirates. Rumors would spread. Daniel knew it. Rumors are a weapon, perhaps more powerful than gunpowder. After the pirate raid, everything changed. Not immediately, not in a single day, but Daniel could feel something invisible shifting in the air of Greystone. People looked at him differently. At him, at the marksman, at the guns in the smithy. Before, it had been the eccentricity of the strange lord. Now it was a weapon that had saved their lives. The difference was enormous. On the 60th day, 5 fishermen came to him. On their own, without an invitation. They said they wanted to shoot. Daniel took them on. On the 62nd day, 3 more came, and 2 women. He took them all. By the 70th day, he had 45 shooters, 20 rifles. The rest waited their turn, practicing with sticks. Wade commanded them like an old bandmaster conducting an orchestra. Firmly, precisely, without unnecessary words. He turned out to be a natural-born rifle infantry officer. Daniel had realized this long ago. Wade thought in terms of lines, sectors, and crossfire. The only thing he lacked was a tool. Now he had that tool. Daniel set about the next step, a lathe. Without it, it's impossible to rifling the barrels. Without rifling, range and accuracy are limited. A smooth-bore barrel has a range of 70 paces with acceptable accuracy. A rifled barrel reaches 200. The difference between life and death. He spent 3 nights designing the lathe, the simplest of constructions. Foot-powered, a pedal, a belt, a spindle, a tool holder, a wooden bed, metal guides. Nothing complicated by the standards of his world. Nightmarishly complicated by the standards of this one. Every part had to be forged by hand. Every bearing had to be replaced with a bronze bushing. Every tolerance had to be met by eye and touch because there was no vernier caliper and nothing to make one from. He showed the blueprints to Hollis. The old man looked at them for a long time. He shook his head. He said he didn't know how to forge half of the parts. Daniel said he'd show him. Eleanor stood nearby. She picked up the spindle drawing. She turned it over in her hands. She put it back down. She took a piece of chalk. And she drew a modified spindle on the smithy floor, with a double support that distributed the load more evenly. Daniel looked at her drawing, then at her. She hadn't studied engineering. She'd never seen a lathe. But she'd looked at the blueprint and, in 5 minutes, improved the critical component. He said she was right, and that her version was better. Eleanor shrugged. She said she could just see how the metal would hold up, where the load would be, where the weak spots were. She'd always seen it that way, ever since she was a child. Her brother Tom couldn't see it. Her father could, but not as well. But she could. It was the first time she'd ever said more than 2 sentences in a row. Daniel remembered it. Building the machine took 20 days. 20 days of hell. Every detail took hours. Bronze bushings instead of bearings. Guides forged and hand-polished with a stone until they were mirror smooth. A belt made of 3 layers of leather that Murph, the leather worker, spent a full day sewing together. A pedal mechanism that broke 4 times before Eleanor redesigned the mounting. Daniel worked in the forge for 16 hours at a time. He'd lie down on a bench by the furnace. He'd wake up. He'd work again. His hands were covered in burns and calluses. His left leg was swollen from standing constantly. Adelaide arrived on the 18th day. A tall, dark-haired woman with a soft voice and a cross on her. A former nun. Excommunicated from the Order of the Holy Flame. She came to Greystone because she'd heard they treated people better here than they prayed. She saw Daniel in the blacksmith shop. She looked at his leg, at his hands. She said that if he didn't lie down, his leg would give out completely in a week. Daniel replied that he didn't have time. Adelaide said that a dead lord is more useless than a lame one, and that she'd seen sepsis and knew how it starts. Daniel looked at his leg. Swelling, redness around the old scar, warm to the touch. Adelaide was right. He lay down. For 2 days. She washed the wound with boiled water and herbs. She applied a bandage. She made him drink a bitter decoction. Daniel endured it and seethed with anger. 2 days without work meant 2 days lost. But Adelaide wouldn't budge. There was a steel core beneath her quiet voice. On the 2nd day of his confinement, he told her about hygiene, about how wounds should be washed with boiled water, not holy water, that you have to wash your hands before touching a wound, that dirt kills more surely than a sword. She listened. She didn't argue. She didn't say it was heresy. She listened and took it in. Then she asked how he knew all this. Daniel said he'd read it. She asked where such books could be found. He remained silent. Adelaide didn't press the matter, but she remembered. 2 days later he got up. His leg was better. Not great, but better. The lathe was ready. Eleanor and Hollis had finished it without him. Daniel walked into the smithy and saw it. A wooden bed, metal guides, a pedal, a belt, a spindle. Primitive, ugly, and beautiful. He pressed the pedal. The spindle began to spin, smoothly, without wobble. Eleanor had polished the bushings to perfection. He took a steel rod, clamped it in place, brought the cutting tool to it. Metal shavings rained down onto the floor. Even, continuous. The lathe was running. In this world where mages levitated wagons and knights rode enchanted horses, a simple foot-powered lathe, the pinnacle of Stone Age technology by Daniel's standards, and an absolute revolution by Greystone's standards. The first thing he made on the lathe was a rifled barrel. Rifling. Spiral grooves inside the barrel. They impart spin to the bullet. A spinning bullet flies straight, like a football. The principle of gyroscopic stabilization. Simple physics. But to this world, it was like a spell cast in an unknown language. He explained it to Eleanor. She listened. She nodded. Not because she understood the physics, but because she sensed the logic. If the bullet spins, it doesn't tumble. If it doesn't tumble, it flies more smoothly. If it flies more smoothly, it hits the target more accurately. A simple chain of reasoning. She helped him cut the rifling. 4 grooves. Rifling pitch. 1 turn per 30 calibers. He remembered the numbers from the tables. The first rifled barrel was ready in 2 days. Daniel fitted it into the rifle stock. He loaded it. He went out to Wade's shooting range. He set up a target 100 paces away. He took aim. He fired. He hit it. Not right in the center, but he hit it. At 100 paces. A smooth-bore flintlock at that distance would have hit the target once in 10 shots. The rifled barrel hit it on the first try. He handed the rifle to Maggie. She took it, took aim, fired, hit the center, at 100 paces, on the first shot. Daniel shook his head. This girl was a miracle. Maggie looked at him, asked if she could try at 150. He nodded. She stepped back. 150 paces. She took a long time to aim. She fired. She hit it. Not the center, the edge of the target. But at 150 paces with a handmade flintlock rifle, that was impossible. She had done the impossible. Daniel then told her, "Maggie, remember when I said you're not an infantryman? You're a sniper. You're the shooter who kills commanders and mages before they have a chance to give an order. One shot, one target, the primary target." Maggie listened. Her eyes burned, not from the killing, from the realization. She doesn't just shoot better than anyone else. She's needed. She's important. She's not just a girl with bad manners whom the guys in the village don't notice. She's a weapon. Daniel promised her he'd make a rifle just for her, tailored to her hands, tailored to her height, to her eye, personalized. Maggie said she'd wait, and that if he lied, she'd shoot him in the ass. Daniel said he had no doubt. Wade stood nearby. He heard it. And for the first time in all those months, Captain Corbin Wade laughed, loudly, from the heart, the way old soldiers laugh when they finally see something real in the young ones. Winter arrived on the 85th day. It didn't creep up on them. It struck. The temperature plummeted overnight. In the morning, frost lay on the rocks. The sea turned leaden and angry. The wind howled between the houses like a hungry beast. Greystone wasn't ready. Almost ready. Not quite. Daniel had been designing the stoves as early as the first week. Cast iron potbelly stoves. A simple design. A box. A door. A chimney. Nothing extra. Hollis began casting them in the third week from remelted scrap metal. By the 85th day, every house had a stove. The peat was burning. Heat was coming through. But there wasn't much peat, and it burned quickly, and it gave off little heat. Daniel counted the supplies every evening, enough peat for 6 weeks. If winter lasted longer, it would be cold. He sent people to the bog to double the harvest. The frozen ground was hard to cut through, but they cut through it. On the 88th day, a convoy arrived. 40 people, women, children, the elderly, refugees. Their village in the south had been burned down by the Church of the Holy Flame, accused of heresy. No one knew exactly what kind. Someone said that the village herbalist had been treating people without a blessing. That was enough. The priests came. They hanged the herbalist. They burned the village. The people fled north, the only place no one wanted to go, Greystone. Daniel stood at the gate and watched them. 40 people, half of them children. Frostbite on their hands and faces. Their shoes were torn, or they had no shoes at all. Hunger in their eyes. Wade stood beside him. He said quietly that there was nothing to feed them, that there was barely enough grain for their own people, that every extra mouth brought them closer to starvation. Daniel said nothing. He knew Wade was right. He knew the math. 2,000 mouths were already on the brink. 40 more was the tipping point. He looked at the woman in the front row. She was holding a child. The girl was about 3 years old. Her lips were blue. Daniel said to take them all in. Wade began to object. Daniel repeated himself. Everyone, now. We'll figure out the food later. Warmth first, life first, then the math. He suspended rifle production for 3 days. The entire blacksmith shop, the entire laboratory, the entire town, everyone was working for the refugees. Hollis forged stovepipes all night long. Eleanor was right beside him. The hammer didn't stop until... Sora was making an ointment for frostbite, badger fat, beeswax, an herbal decoction based on Adelaide's recipe. Not a cure, but it eases the pain and protects the skin from cracking. Adelaide was tucking the children in. She washed them. She bandaged them. She sang soft lullabies she remembered from the convent. Maggie hauled bales. She carried water. She growled at anyone who stood around doing nothing. Daniel sketched a pattern for boots with double soles. Murph, the tanner, cut and sewed. By the morning of the second day, every refugee had a pair of boots. Not pretty, rough, but warm. Everyone was fed from a communal pot, double portions for the children, fish stew with seaweed, not tasty, but hot. At dawn on the third day, an old woman from among the refugees approached Daniel, small, hunchbacked, her face wrinkled like the bark of an old tree. She dropped to her knees. She held out a ring to him, a copper ring, dull, a wedding ring. It was the last thing she had. Daniel looked at the ring, then at the old woman. He knelt down across from her. His leg howled with pain. He ignored it. He took her hand. He slipped the ring back onto her finger and said quietly, "We don't charge for heat here. It's not charity. It's just the way it should be." The old woman began to cry, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her wrinkles. Daniel stood up, turned around, and saw that the entire square was standing there watching him. Fishermen, convicts, archers, the blacksmith, the alchemist, the captain, everyone. At that moment, Greystone became his. Not by decree of the Duke, not by right of blood, by the right of a man who had knelt in the mud before the old woman and refused the only thing she could offer. Eleanor stood by the forge, soot on her cheek, a hammer in her hand. She looked at him, and for the first time in all this time, there was something in her eyes other than pain and weariness, something warm. She didn't yet know what to call it, but it was there. The refugees had brought more than just hunger with them. They had brought news. The Church of the Holy Flame was strengthening its influence in the South. They were burning more than just herbalists. They were burning anyone who did anything they didn't understand. Blacksmiths who experimented with new alloys. Millers who built new mechanisms. Any innovation was heresy. Any change was a challenge to the divine order. Daniel listened and felt a chill run through him. If the church finds out that guns and gunpowder are being made in Greystone, if they find out about Sora's laboratory, about the lathe, they won't come with accusations. They'll come with an army. He spoke with Adelaide. She knew the church from the inside, knew the hierarchy, knew how they thought. She said that the church fears not the new. The church fears the loss of control. Magic is a divine gift. If someone gives commoners power without magic, it means that magic isn't unique, that the divine order isn't absolute, that something might be possible without God, or without the church, which, to them, is one and the same. Daniel nodded. He understood. In his world, it was called the monopoly on violence. Whoever controls power controls everything. Mages in the church controlled power through magic. Gunpowder was shattering that monopoly. A fisherman with a gun is equal to a mage with a fireball bomb. This isn't a technological revolution. It's a political one, and people get killed for political revolutions. He decided he needed intelligence. He needed to know what was happening beyond Greystone, what the church was doing, what the empire was doing, what his family was doing. He was blind on his own peninsula. He sees only the sea and the rocks, but his enemies see him. Reed, a convict who used to hunt for Grey and trade in salt, the only one who knew the roads and the ports. Daniel asked him to be Greystone's eyes, to walk through the villages, to listen, to remember, to bring back news, to pay for information with salt. Reed agreed, not out of loyalty, out of self-interest. His life in Greystone was better than it had been in the penal colony. He wanted it to stay that way, so he needed to know where the threat would come from. On the 90th day, Daniel set about the task he had been putting off. Edward Castle's notes. He returned to the lighthouse basement every evening. He read by candlelight, slowly. Castle wrote in small handwriting, and his penmanship deteriorated toward the end. Daniel jotted down the key facts. Castle arrived around 1791 local time. The body of a peasant. No status. He spent 2 years building a loom. He caught the attention of a merchant who financed the workshop. He caught the attention of a local baron who wanted a monopoly on cloth. He caught the church's attention. The church sent an investigator. The investigator questioned Castle for 3 days. He wasn't interested in the loom. He was interested in his memory. How do you know? Who taught you? What else do you remember? Castle lied. He said he'd read it in a book. Which one? I don't remember. The interrogator didn't believe him. Last entry. They came for what I remember about gunpowder. Castle wasn't a gunsmith, but anyone from late 18th century England knew about gunpowder. The Napoleonic Wars were right on their doorstep. Gunpowder was part of the air, and someone in this world knew that people like Castle remembered things about gunpowder, knew and was searching. Daniel closed the notebook. He sat in the darkness of the basement. He thought. 200 years ago, someone was looking for time travelers, looking for their knowledge. The 100th day, 3 months and 10 days. Daniel sat at the table and counted. 25 guns, 5 of them rifled. 45 trained marksmen. Gunpowder for 2,000 shots, 3,000 bullets. The saltpeter pits provide a steady yield. The saltworks supply iron and grain. Greystone's population had grown to 2,300, including refugees and new arrivals. 3 tanners, 2 carpenters, 1 potter. People kept coming. One by one, in pairs, in families. Word was spreading along the coast. There's work in Greystone. There's food. There's a strange lord who pays and doesn't beat people. That was more than most places in the kingdom could offer. Daniel found Adelaide and gave her an empty house next to a hospital. She raised an eyebrow. He said there would be wounded people in the coming months. Gunshot wounds aren't like cuts or fractures. A lead bullet shatters bones and tears through tissue. If you don't know how to treat such wounds, people will die from infection faster than from the wound itself. He told her everything he knew. Not much. He wasn't a doctor. But he'd taken a first aid course at the factory. He knew about tourniquets, about washing wounds, about how dirty instruments kill, about boiling as a method of sterilization. Adelaide took notes, every word, with charcoal on slates. Then she copied them onto paper that Daniel had managed to get through read. She asked about antiseptic. Daniel thought for a moment. Alcohol, the simplest antiseptic. You can distill it from anything. Grain, fruit, even seaweed if you ferment it. He went to see Sora. He explained that he needed a still. Sora said she knew how to make one. She'd been distilling substances her whole life. A week later, Adelaide had alcohol. Rough, smelly, but burning with a blue flame. Strong enough to kill the infection in her wounds. Adelaide washed her hands with it. She looked at her palms. She said it was a miracle. Daniel replied that it was chemistry. She smiled, quietly. The first smile he'd ever seen on her face. On the 105th day, Reed returned with news. Bad news. Tevran intelligence. 5 horsemen had crossed the isthmus 12 days ago. They were heading west along the coast. They asked around in the villages. About Greystone. About the Lord. About unusual sounds. Someone in the villages had heard gunshots. The sound carried across the water. The scouts took notes. They rode on. Daniel clenched his teeth. Sooner than he'd expected. He'd thought the reconnaissance would arrive in half a year. It arrived in 3. So the Tevrans are in a hurry. Or someone tipped them off. He called a meeting. Wade, Hollis, Sora, Adelaide, Gale, and Maggie. He included her because she had commanded the advance patrol on the cliffs and knew the approaches to Greystone better than anyone. Daniel said there were 5 Tevran scouts somewhere on the peninsula, that they'd return home with information, that 2 to 3 months after their return, the vanguard would arrive. If they returned. Wade understood immediately. He looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded. They must not return. No one in the room objected. It was war. Not officially declared, but war nonetheless. And in war, Scouts aren't sent back with intelligence. Daniel planned an ambush. The isthmus, the only way back. The scouts would return that way. 20 shooters behind the rocks. 2 lines. The first line with smoothbore rifles. The second line with rifled rifles. Maggie up top with the best rifle. The order was simple. Not a single one gets away. They waited 6 days. On the 7th day, a lookout on the southern cliffs spotted 5 horsemen. They were riding calmly. The reconnaissance mission was complete. They were returning home. Across the pass. Daniel stood on the hill with his spyglass. He could see their faces. Young, professional, good horses, good equipment, not rookies, experienced scouts of the Imperial Army. In another life, he would have had a beer with them. They were horsemen. He was a motorist. Different eras, same profession. To serve and carry out orders. They rode onto the isthmus. 300 steps, narrow, cliffs on either side. A perfect trap. 100 paces to the front line. 80, 60. Daniel lowered his hand. Wade gave the command. Fire. 20 rifles fired simultaneously. The horses reared up. 2 riders were thrown from their saddles. A third took a bullet in the side and doubled over. A fourth turned his horse around. A fifth charged forward straight at the shooters, sword in hand. Brave, foolish, or desperate. A second volley. The front line. 13 seconds. A record. The 5th rider fell along with his horse. The 4th galloped toward the exit of the isthmus. Maggie fired from above, 120 paces away. At a moving target, she hit him. The rider jerked and slid off his horse. The horse galloped off alone. Silence. The smoke was clearing. 5 bodies on the rocks of the isthmus. 5 Tevran scouts. They won't be returning home. Their report won't reach headquarters. Greystone had bought himself some time. How much? 2 months. Maybe 3. When the scouts don't return, the Empire will send a second group. Then a third. And then it will stop sending scouts and send an army instead. Daniel made his way down to the isthmus. He looked at the bodies. He didn't throw up this time. He wished he had. Nausea means you're still human. The absence of nausea means you're getting used to it. And you can't get used to killing. You just can't. He ordered them to be buried. With dignity. With stones on their graves. No names. He didn't know their names. The horses were taken. 5 fine horses. The weapons, too. Swords. Daggers. 1 crossbow. Chainmail. It'll all come in handy. They found maps on the saddles. Detailed ones. Tevran maps of the coast with markings. Daniel studied them by candlelight all night. The markings showed the invasion route. The coast. The isthmus. Greystone. And further east toward the capital of Aerland. Greystone wasn't even the target. Greystone was a point along the way. A staging area. A place where the invading army was supposed to set up camp, replenish supplies, and move on. They weren't planning to conquer Greystone. They intended to pass right through it, as if it were a void. Daniel set the map aside. Now he knew the route. He knew the direction. He knew the enemy's logic. And he knew that, to the Tevrans, Greystone was not a fortress. It was a door. That meant his task was not simply to defend. His task was to shut the door. So tightly that no one could get through. The next day, he began designing fortifying the isthmus in earnest. 3 lines of trenches, just as he'd planned at the first meeting, but now with details. The first line, rifle pits, chest deep, a parapet of stone and earth, emplacements for rifles, positions for riflemen with clearly defined firing sectors. The second line, the main, deeper, with dugouts for protection against magic. If a mage strikes the first line, the riflemen fall back to the second. Third line, for cannons, when the cannons arrive. And in front of all this, a field, flat, open, within firing range. He'll clear the brush, remove the rocks, create a perfect killing zone 200 paces wide. Anyone who steps onto this field will find themselves under crossfire from both lines and sniper fire from above. Wade looked at the plan. He was silent for a long time. Then he said it was a fortress, without walls, but a fortress nonetheless. Daniel replied that walls hold stone, but trenches hold people. Stone breaks, people don't. Wade nodded. He was beginning to believe it. Day 120. 4 months. Daniel stood by the forge and watched as Eleanor forged the part that would change everything. A percussion cap, a small copper cap with an explosive charge inside. A principle invented by Alexander Forsyth in 1807. A blow to the cap crushes the copper and ignites the fulminate of mercury. The fulminate of mercury produces a flash. The flash ignites the gunpowder. No flint, no matchlock, no misfires in the rain. A flintlock misfires every 4th shot in wet weather. A percussion cap never misfires. The difference between life and death for a shooter in the rain. Sora made the fulminating mercury. 3 weeks of work. 2 failed reactions. 1 small explosion singed her eyebrows and her left sleeve. She cursed in a language Daniel didn't know and carried on. By the 3rd week, tiny white crystals lay in the glass flask. Mercury fulminate, the most sensitive explosive that can be made from readily available ingredients. 1 gram is enough for 200 caps. Daniel looked at the crystals and thought how beautiful they were, and that any one of them could blow off a finger. Sora told him he was an idiot, and not to go near the flask without her permission. He agreed. She was right. Eleanor was stamping out caps from copper sheet. The sheet was lousy, uneven in thickness. From each sheet, only 20 usable caps were produced out of 30 stamped. 10 were rejects. Daniel winced at every defective cap. Copper was expensive. Every gram counted. But 10 out of 30 is a 67% yield. For handmade production in a medieval smithy, that's fantastic. He told Eleanor she was a genius. She shrugged. She said the copper was lousy, and that if the sheet had been even, she'd have produced 25 out of 30. He laughed. She looked at him in surprise. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. They assembled the first cap lock on the 125th day. Daniel and Hollis worked together. The trigger, the striker, the spring, the flash tube. Everything was simpler than a flintlock. Fewer parts, fewer points of failure, more reliable, faster to manufacture. They loaded it. They went out. Rain. A fine, nasty autumn rain. Perfect. Daniel took aim. He pulled the trigger. The striker clicked. The primer popped. A shot. Clean, smooth, in the rain. No misfire. Hollis stood nearby, his mouth agape. He remembered how his flintlock pistol had misfired 3 times in a row yesterday because of the damp. But this thing fired on the first try, in the rain. Daniel reloaded, fired again. No misfire again. And again. And again. 4 shots out of 4, in the pouring rain. Hollis sat down on a rock. He was exhausted. He said this changed everything. Daniel nodded. It changed everything. And this was only the first step toward the next goal. A revolver, a multi-shot weapon. But a revolver was still a long way off. First, they had to convert all the guns to percussion locks. Sora demanded an increase in the mercury supply. Daniel agreed. Mercury could be extracted from cinnabar. Reed reported that in the mountains to the south of the hot springs, there were red stones, possibly cinnabar. An expedition was needed. Daniel sent 4 men. On the 130th day, Lady Rowena Ashford arrived in Greystone. She arrived on horseback, alone, without an entourage, without guards. That was the first thing that surprised Daniel. An aristocrat traveling alone. That meant she was either mad, dangerous, or both. She dismounted in the square. Her light hair was tucked under a traveling hood. Her dress was expensive but practical for horseback riding. Her posture was as straight as a blade. Her face was beautiful and utterly inscrutable. She introduced herself. Lady Rowena Ashford, daughter of the Duke of Ashford. She had arrived as a diplomatic observer on behalf of her father. Daniel knew the name Ashford from Devon's memories. the Duke of Ashford, a southern vassal of the crown, disgraced, half exiled. His lands bordered Tevran territory, and he would be the first to bear the brunt of an invasion. Ashford was no friend of the Westmarks. But he was no enemy either. He was a pragmatist, and he had sent his daughter to Greystone. Not a son, not a knight, his daughter. It was a gesture. Daniel didn't yet understand exactly what kind. He invited her into his home, offered her tea. There was no tea. He offered her an herbal infusion. Rowena accepted it with impeccable politeness that could mean anything from sincere interest to icy contempt. She said her father had heard about Greystone, about the strange lord who was building something unusual, about the thunder from the peninsula, about the pirates who had been repelled without magic or swords. Her father wanted to know what was going on, and he wanted Lord Westmark as looking for allies. Daniel looked at her. She looked at him. Two predators sized each other up across a table set with herbal tea. He said he needed allies, but first she had to see for herself. He showed her the city, the smithy, the laboratory, the shooting range, the lathe, the hospital, the salt works. Rowena walked beside him and asked questions, precise, intelligent, each question like a scalpel. How many guns? How many shooters? Where does the gunpowder come from? What's the range? What is the cost per shot? How many people are needed for production? She didn't ask about magic even once. She asked about economics and logistics. Daniel realized she wasn't a spy, not a diplomat, a strategist. She thought in terms of armies, budgets, and supply chains. At the shooting range, Wade demonstrated a volley for her. 10 shooters, a command, a roar, smoke. 10 holes in the target 60 paces away. Rowena stood and watched. Her face didn't flinch. No fear, no surprise, just thought. A quick, cold thought behind those icy eyes. She turned to Daniel. She said she understood, that this wasn't just a weapon, it was a new kind of war, and that her father would be very interested. Daniel nodded. He asked what the Duke of Ashford wanted in return. Rowena answered directly. Guns, 20 of them to start with, and training. 10 of his men would undergo training in Greystone. Daniel said he would discuss the terms, but he had one condition of his own. Lady Rowena would remain in Greystone as Duke Ashford's permanent representative. She raised an eyebrow. She asked why. He replied that he needed someone who understood politics, because he was an engineer. He could build a cannon but couldn't forge an alliance, and without alliances, cannons were useless. Rowena looked at him for a long time. Then she tilted her head slightly. She said she agreed. That evening they played chess. Daniel had carved the board himself from fragments of ship's wood. Eleanor had carved the pieces on a lathe, rough but recognizable. Rowena played skillfully. She sacrificed pawns for position. She built long combinations. Daniel lost the first game in 20 moves. He lost the second in 30. In the third, he managed a draw. Rowena said that he was a quick learner. Daniel replied that he was an engineer. Engineers analyze their defeats. She smiled slightly. The first crack in her icy facade. The council meeting took place the next day. The full council. Wade, Hollis, Sora, Adelaide, Maggie, Gale, and now Rowena. 7 people at the table in Lord Greystone's stone house. Daniel said that Lady Rowena would make the decision regarding the alliance with the Ashfords, that he understood less about politics than she did. In public. In front of everyone. Rowena froze for a moment. Just a moment. Then she nodded, calmly, as if it were normal, as if the aristocrats handed decisions over to her every day, as if someone had been asking her opinion her whole life. No one had ever asked. 27 years, 3 broken engagements, sold twice and returned twice like defective merchandise because one fiancé died and the other found someone richer. And now a lame, magicless lord of the Stone Peninsula was publicly handing her a strategic decision. In front of the captain, in front of the blacksmith, in front of the alchemist, in front of everyone. She didn't sleep that night until dawn. She stood by the window and looked out at the sea. She was thinking, not about the alliance, about him, the 150th day. 5 months. Daniel stood in the smithy, holding in his hands something this world had never seen before. A revolver, a 5-shot percussion revolver, a cylinder with 5 chambers. Each chamber was a separate barrel with its own charge and primer, 5 shots without reloading. In a world where the best marksman fires 1 shot every 20 seconds, it was like giving a person 5 lives. Eleanor spent 3 days shaping the cylinder on a lathe. She drilled the chambers by hand. She checked each one against a template that Daniel had cut out of sheet metal. The tolerance was the thickness of a fingernail. For this world, that was incredible precision. For Daniel, it was a painful compromise. At the factory in Hartford, the tolerance was in the hundredths of a millimeter. Here, he was happy if the cylinder didn't jam when turned. Hollis made the frame, forged. Heavier than he would have liked, but sturdy. Daniel assembled the trigger mechanism himself, the springs, the hammer, the sear. He fitted every part with a file by candlelight until late at night. The barrel was rifled, 4 grooves. The caliber was slightly larger than that of rifles. The grip was made of walnut wood that Reed had brought from the port, the only piece of real wood, not driftwood. Daniel held the revolver and felt its weight. Heavy, rough, clumsy compared to a Colt, but it got the job done. 5 shots. He stepped out into the yard. It was early morning. Fog was creeping over the stones. He aimed at a target 20 paces away. He fired. Hit it. He spun the cylinder. He fired again. Hit. 3rd, 4th, 5th. 5 shots in 12 seconds. 5 holes in the target. The smoke cleared. Daniel lowered his hand. It was trembling. Not from the recoil, from the realization of what he had just created. Captain Wade came over at the sound of the shots. He saw the target. 5 holes. He looked at the revolver. Daniel handed him the weapon. Wade took it. He turned it over in his hands. Heavy, well made. It fit in one hand. Daniel explained, 5 shots, no reloading. For a commander, for a scout, for the last line of defense when a rifle is already useless because the enemy is too close. Wade raised the revolver. He took aim. He fired. He hit the target. The old soldier's hand didn't tremble. He fired all 5 shots. Then he lowered his hand. He looked at Daniel. His eyes were wet. An old man, 20 years in the infantry, 10 years on a forgotten peninsula. He held in his hand something that was worth more than any knight's sword, and that thing had been made for him, just for him. Daniel said quietly, "This is your captain, your first and only one." "See you later," Wade swallowed. He nodded. He tucked the revolver into his belt, and he headed to the firing range to train his men, his back straight, his stride firm, just like 20 years ago, when he still believed that service had meaning. On the 155th day, the 2nd Tevran Reconnaissance Unit entered the peninsula. 8 men, not 5, and a mage with them. A sentry on the cliff spotted them 3 miles away. He ran to Wade. Wade went to Daniel. 9 men, 1 in a robe, a mage. Daniel went cold. A mage. The first mage they were about to face. He didn't know what a battle mage was capable of. Devin's memories were fragmented. Fire, lightning, shields of air, levitation. A single mage is worth 100 soldiers, in theory. Daniel had no practical experience. He called a quick meeting, 15 minutes. Sora had said that a magical shield is a concentration of energy in front of the mage, a wall of compressed air or fire. It stops arrows and swords. But a shield works in only one direction. A mage sees a threat and places a shield between himself and the threat. If the threat comes from 2 sides, he puts up 2 shields, but that requires twice more power. If it comes from 3 sides, 3 shields. The limit for any mage is 4 shields at once, and no mage raises a shield in advance, only when they see the attack coming. Daniel nodded. Speed. It's all about speed. An arrow flies slowly. A mage sees the archer, sees the arrow, and raises a shield. A bullet travels faster than the speed of sound. A mage hears the shot only after the bullet has already passed through him. He won't have time to raise a shield unless he knows where the shot is coming from, unless he sees the shooter, if the first shot is accurate. Everyone looked at Maggie. She was sitting in the corner cleaning her rifle. She looked up. She understood. She nodded. The plan was simple. An ambush at the isthmus, just like last time. 20 archers in 2 lines to take out the regular soldiers. Maggie on a rock off to the side, far from the rest, a separate position. She had one target, the mage. The first shot at the mage. Before he realized where the shot was coming from, before he raised his shield. One shot, one bullet. A distance of 150 paces. Maggie asked how to tell a mage apart from the soldiers. Daniel said the mage would be wearing a robe, no armor. Mages don't wear armor, they don't need it. They have a shield. Maggie smiled. Subtle, cold. She said that a robe is a big target. They waited 2 days. On the 3rd day, the scouting party entered the isthmus. 8 soldiers on horseback, the mage behind them. In a dark robe, no helmet, a young face, self-assured. Why wear a helmet when you can stop an arrow with a glance? 150 paces. Maggie was lying on a rock, her rifle propped against the stone. The wind was blowing in from the sea. She adjusted her sights for the wind. To the left, slightly higher. Her breathing was steady, her heartbeat slow. She waited. The mage was riding, calmly, glancing back. Maybe he sensed something, maybe not. Maggie fired. A loud bang. The mage flinched. The bullet entered his chest. He began to raise his arm, instinct to raise his shield. But the bullet was already inside. A shield is useless once the lead has pierced the ribs. The mage fell from his horse, slowly, surprised. He didn't understand what had happened. He died without understanding. A second later, Wade ordered a volley. 20 rifles struck the rest. 6 of the 8 fell. 2 turned and ran. Maggie reloaded. She fired. 1 fell. The second was caught by the volley from the second line. Silence. 9 bodies lay on the rocks of the isthmus. The mage lay on his back. His eyes were open. His face was young, about 25. His robe was soaked with blood. Daniel approached. He looked. A boy. Younger than he'd seemed from a distance. A mage. A man who could burn down a house with a single gesture. And a round piece of lead weighing 12 grams killed him before he could make that gesture. That's all. That's the whole difference between the age of magic and the age of gunpowder. Speed. Whoever is faster survives. Maggie climbed down from the cliff. She walked over to the mage's body. She looked at it. Her face was pale, but her hands didn't tremble. She said he was young. Daniel replied that war doesn't ask about age. Maggie nodded. She turned away. She went to clean her rifle. This time she didn't say she was lying about being okay. And Daniel didn't ask. Some things only time can heal. Or maybe not. Day 170. Greystone was buzzing like a beehive. Not out of fear, out of work. The foundry was running at full capacity. Hollis and 2 new blacksmiths who'd come with the refugees were pouring bronze into the molds. Bronze isn't steel. It's softer, weaker. But it'll do for the first cannons. Daniel was designing a 6-pounder, a field cannon. Lightweight, mobile, on a wooden carriage with 2 wheels. The barrel was bronze, 6 calibers long, a half-pound charge of gunpowder. The projectile is a 6-pound cast-iron cannonball or grape shot. Grape shot is a tin can filled with lead bullets. When fired, the can bursts and the bullets fly out in a fan shape. At 100 paces, grape shot covers an area 10 by 10 paces. Everything living within that area ceases to be alive. Eleanor cast the barrel herself. The first one burst during testing, a casting defect, an air bubble in the wall. The second one passed inspection. The third was perfect. She had learned to sense bronze the way she sensed steel. Every metal had its own character. Steel was stubborn and honest. Bronze was cunning and fluid. Eleanor spoke to the bronze, not out loud, with her hands, through temperature, through the speed of pouring. Daniel watched her work and thought that in another world she would be running a steel mill. Here she stood by the furnace in a leather apron, soot on her face, and she was beautiful in the way that people who accomplish the impossible are beautiful. He caught himself having that thought. He pushed it aside. Not the time. Then he caught himself again. He didn't push it away. On the 175th day, the first cannon was ready. A bronze barrel on an oak carriage. The wheels were shod with iron. A percussion cap fuse, at Daniel's insistence. No fuse. A fuse means a delay of seconds and gives away the position. A percussion cap means an instant shot. They conducted the test on the isthmus. They loaded it with a cannonball. The target was an old fishing boat positioned 200 paces away. Daniel aimed. He adjusted the sights. He pulled the cord. A roar. The ground shook. A cloud of smoke. The shell struck the boat and blew it to smithereens. Literally. The sides were blown apart. The keel snapped. All that remained of the boat was a pile of debris. The men at their positions were silent. They'd seen guns and were used to the roar of gunfire. But this was different. It was a roar, a heavy, gut-wrenching roar that pounded in his chest and lingered in his bones. Wade walked over to the wreckage. He touched it. He turned to Daniel. His face was ashen. He said it was murder, not war, murder. 200 paces away, with a single shot, an entire boat. Daniel replied that it was a 6-pounder, the smallest field gun, entry level. A 12-pounder has a range of 400 paces. A 24-pounder can penetrate a fortress wall, and then there are mortars that fire over the wall at an arc. Wade was silent for a moment. Then he said he wanted 6 of those, for the battle. Daniel said there would be 4. They wouldn't have time for more. Not enough bronze, not enough time. Wade nodded. 4 cannons, 30 muskets, 50 riflemen, 3 lines of trenches, mines. Daniel hadn't mentioned the mines yet. That was his last trump card, the most terrifying one. A mine is a pot of gunpowder buried in the ground. Covered with a layer of rocks and scrap metal, the fuse leads to the sapper's position, where he waits for the enemy to step on the right spot. He pulls the cord. An explosion. Stones and metal fly upward and to the sides. The blast radius is 30 paces. Daniel had laid 12 mines in front of the first line of trenches, each one under a sack of stones, each one with a fuse leading into the sapper's trench. 12 mines. 12 traps in the open, flat field that looked so harmless. Sora made the charges. Pots of gunpowder, fuses made of oiled rope, and percussion caps. She worked calmly and methodically, as always. Daniel asked her once if she wasn't afraid. She replied that she'd been afraid since she was 14, when the first chemical exploded in her hands and left a burn on her cheek. Since then, she's lived with fear every day. She's gotten used to it. Daniel said that getting used to fear is dangerous. Sora replied that not getting used to it was even more dangerous. He couldn't think of a counter-argument. On the 180th day, Reed returned from the south with news that made Daniel clench his fists. His brother, Isaac von Westmark, had sent men. Not an army. 3 of them. Quiet, inconspicuous. They were asking around in the harbor taverns about Greystone, about the Lord, about what he was up to. Reed said that one of the 3 carried a dagger bearing the Westmark coat of arms. Not a scout, an assassin. Daniel sat in his house and thought. His brother, his younger brother, Isaac. Fragments of memory surfaced from Devin's past. Isaac, golden-haired and talented, a fire mage, his father's favorite. The heir after his older brother died in a tournament 2 years ago. Isaac, who was always smiling and always got his way, and who couldn't allow his crippled, written-off brother to suddenly become someone. Because if Devin is alive and strong, that's a threat to the inheritance, a threat to the title, a threat to everything Isaac considered rightfully his. Daniel called for Rowena. She came. She sat across from him. She listened. Her face didn't flicker. She said there would be more killers, that Isaac wouldn't stop as long as Devin was alive, and that there were two paths. The first, kill Isaac. Daniel shook his head. Rowena continued. The second, become so strong that Isaac wouldn't dare, so that the cost of killing Lord Greystone would be higher than the cost of making peace with him. Daniel asked how. Rowena said they needed an alliance, an official one, with her father, with the other disgraced lords, with those who fear the Tevrans more than their own king. If Greystone became the center of the alliance, then killing him would be an act of war, not against a single lame boy, but against a coalition. Daniel looked at her. She spoke of politics the way he spoke of blueprints, precise, clear, emotionless. Every word in its place, like a cog in a machine. He said he trusted her. She nodded. She began writing letters, that very night. 3 letters, to the Duke of Ashford, to the Earl of Malern in the east, to Baron Travers in the southeast. All 3 bordered Tevran territory. All 3 were out of favor at court. All 3 feared an invasion and knew the crown would not protect them. Rowena offered them what Daniel had offered: guns, training, protection, in exchange for iron, grain, people, and political cover. Daniel signed the letters. His hand trembled, not out of fear, out of realization. He was no longer just building weapons in his workshop. He was building a nation. Reed took the letters away at dawn. 3 days later, Isaac's 3 men were found near the isthmus. Maggie's sentries spotted them at night. They had tried to pass unnoticed. It didn't work. Wade took them alive. They were interrogated in the town hall basement. Daniel wasn't present. Wade handled it himself. 2 of them remained silent. The third spoke up when he realized they wouldn't be released. He confirmed it. Isaac von Westmark. Order to kill. Quietly. Without a trace. Poison, preferably. Daniel ordered them to be released, all 3 of them. Wade objected. Abruptly. He said it was madness. Daniel explained. Dead assassins won't report back to Isaac. He'll send new ones, and more, endlessly. But living assassins will return and say that Greystone knew, that they were expected, that Lord Greystone isn't as weak as he seems. Fear works better than death. Wade frowned, but he obeyed. The 3 were sent across the isthmus, unarmed, on foot, with a message for Isaac. Daniel wrote it himself. 3 words. I know. Enough. The 200th day. Greystone was waiting. Everyone knew the Tevrans would come. 2 scouting parties hadn't returned. The Empire does not forgive silence. When a scouting party goes missing, the vanguard is next. Daniel was counting the days. According to his calculations, after the 2nd reconnaissance mission went missing, Imperial headquarters would spend a month mobilizing, and another month marching. That made it the 220th day. Give or take 2 weeks. He had 20 days. He spent them the way an engineer spends the final days before a project deadline. On everything at once. 4 cannons were positioned on the 3rd line of trenches, bronze barrels on oak carriages. Sighting marks were driven into the ground every 50 paces on the field in front of the position. Firing tables had been drawn up. Every artilleryman knew his sector. 35 guns. 10 of them were rifled. 52 riflemen. 20 of them were veterans of a pirate battle and 2 ambushes. The rest were new recruits, but well-trained. Wade had them drilling non-stop. Fire! Reload! Fire! Move! Take cover! Fire again! He had reduced the reload time to 15 seconds. 4 volleys per minute from 2 lines. Maggie received her rifle. Personalized. Daniel had spent 3 weeks making it. A rifled barrel with reinforced grooves. The stock was adjusted to her height. The trigger pull was set to her hand. The trigger guard was shaped for her finger. The sight rail had 2 front sights for different ranges. Her initials were burned into the stock. M.D. He gave her the rifle on the morning of the 210th day. Maggie took it. She raised it to her shoulder. She took aim, lowered it, looked at the initials. then at him. Her eyes sparkled. She said that if he ever made one like that for another girl, she'd shoot his other leg off. Daniel said he'd keep that in mind. Maggie laughed, loudly, like a sailor, and she went to her rock to test-fire her new weapon. Eleanor saw it. She was standing by the smithy. She watched Maggie walk away. Then she turned her gaze to Daniel. Something flashed across her face. Not jealousy, not anger. A question. A quiet question in her gray eyes. Daniel walked over to her. He said he'd make something else for her, not a rifle. He took a bundle out of his pocket, unwrapped it. A set of engineering tools, a compass, a ruler, a set square, a straight edge, all forged from steel, all precise, all gleaming. He'd made them himself, at night, when no one was watching. He said these were an engineer's tools, that she was Greystone's first engineer. Not a blacksmith, not an apprentice, an engineer. Eleanor took the compass. She opened it, closed it, ran her finger along the steel leg, looked at him. Her eyes were wet. She didn't say anything, but she took his hand, for a second, tightly. Her palm was hot and rough from the hammer, and that 1 second was worth all the words she hadn't said in half a year. Rowena brought the replies to the letters. Duke Ashford agrees. He's sending 20 soldiers for training and a supply train with grain and iron. Earl Mallorn is cautious, but doesn't refuse. He's asking for time. Baron Travers agrees unconditionally. His lands are closest to the Tevran border, and he's desperate. He's sending 15 men and silver. Daniel looked at the map. 3 allies, 3 points along the southern arc. Greystone in the northwest. Together, they formed a line. Not an army, but a line. The beginning of something that could be called a coalition. Rowena said that wasn't enough for war, but it was enough for politics. If Greystone held out against a Tevran attack, others would join the alliance. Victory attracts allies. Defeat buries them. Daniel nodded. So, they needed a victory. On the 215th day, Ashford's and Trevor's men arrived. 35 men, soldiers, real ones, not fishermen, not convicts, men who wielded swords and wore chainmail. Wade met them at the isthmus. He took their swords. He issued them rifles. He said swords weren't needed here. The soldiers grumbled. Wade showed them a volley. 10 rifles. 10 holes in the target 60 paces away. The grumbling died down. 5 days for training. It wasn't enough. Criminally short. But there were no other 5 days. Wade drove the recruits from dawn till dusk. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. Until their hands remembered. Until their bodies became part of the weapon. On the 218th day, the lookouts saw dust to the south. A lot of dust. An army. Daniel climbed the observation hill, spotting scope. His heart was pounding. He saw the column, a long one. Infantry in formation, cavalry on the flanks, the supply train behind. Banners. Tevran banners. A black eagle on a red field. He counted. Infantry. Ranks of 20. Ranks. He lost count. Counted again. About 2,000 infantry. Cavalry. 300, maybe more. The gleam of armor. Knights. Enchanted armor. And behind the supply train, 4 figures in robes. Mages. 4 battle mages. Daniel had 87 archers, 4 cannons, 12 mines, 3 lines of trenches, and 1 sniper on the cliff. Against 2,300 soldiers, 300 knights, and 4 mages. He stood on the hill and watched the advancing army. At the front, riding a raven-black horse, was a man in black armor. Lord Commander Marcus Tane. Daniel didn't know his name. Not yet. But he saw how he rode, straight ahead, confidently. A man accustomed to victory. Daniel made his way down to the positions. He walked along the trenches. The archers sat behind the parapet. They looked at him. They waited. He saw their faces. Bart, with a healed scar on his cheek. Reed, with a spare powder flask on his belt. The young men from among the refugees he'd taken in that winter. The soldiers of Ashford and Trevor who'd picked up a rifle for the first time 5 days ago. They were all looking at the limping lord in his scorched apron over his cloak. Daniel said he wouldn't give any speeches, that everyone knew why he was there, that the rifles in their hands put them on equal footing with any knight, that the cannons behind them put them on equal footing with any mage, that they were standing at the only narrow pass through which anyone could get, and that he trusted every one of them because he knew each of them by name. Then he went up to the observation hill, to the spyglass, to the maps, to the signal flags. That was his place. He's no hero. He's the mastermind. They'll be the ones doing the fighting. The Battle of the Greystone Isthmus began at dawn on the 220th day. Tane took his time. He set up camp a mile from the isthmus. He spent the night studying the position. He sent out foot scouts that night. 2 of the 4 did not return. Maggie's sentries spotted them in the dark. The 2 who returned reported, trenches, strange positions in the ground, no walls. Tane listened. He didn't understand what trenches meant. No one in this world dug trenches for defense. Walls, towers, gates. That's how people wage war, not with holes in the ground. But Tane was cautious. He sent out scouts. 2 didn't return. People were disappearing near that place. Something wasn't right here. He decided to launch a classic attack. Infantry in the center, knights on the flanks, mages in the rear. The infantry breaks through the formation. The knights finish them off. The mages provide cover. Simple, reliable. It had worked for 20 years. Morning. Fog rolling in from the sea. The Tevran infantry lined up in columns of 20. 100 ranks, 2,000 men, shields raised, spears extended, drums beat the rhythm. Step, step, step. They entered the field in front of the isthmus, open, flat, cleared of rocks and brush. 200 paces to the first line of trenches. Daniel stood on the hill, a spyglass, signal flags nearby. Lena stood behind him with a notebook. She was writing everything down, every minute, every order, every observation. A 14-year-old girl with a pencil in her hand. Secretary, keeper, chronicler. 200 steps. Daniel waited. 180, 160. The column marched in perfect formation, beautifully, professionally. Tane knew his business. His infantry was the best in the Tevran army. 140 paces. The first mine. Daniel raised the red flag. A sapper in the trench pulled the cord. The ground exploded. A pillar of fire and rocks rose in the middle of the column. A roar, screams. A dozen infantrymen were thrown back like rag dolls. The column froze. For a second. Just a second. Then the drums beat faster. The officers bellowed. The infantry charged forward. Through the smoke, through the screams of the wounded. The right tactic. Don't stand still. Run toward the enemy. Close the distance. 120 paces. The second mine. The third. The fourth. The explosions came one after another. The field turned into hell. Smoke, fire, rocks flying, the ground shaking. The infantry split into sectors. Some ran forward. Others retreated. Still others simply fell to the ground and covered their heads. 80 paces. The first line of trenches. Wade gave the order. Volley. 40 rifles fired simultaneously. A wall of smoke, a wall of lead. The front ranks of the infantry fell like grass under a sickle. Reload. 15 seconds. Volley. Another row. Another. The Tevrans couldn't turn around. The isthmus was narrow. 300 paces. A flanking maneuver was impossible. A cliff on the left. A swamp on the right. Only forward. Straight into the barrels. Tane watched it all from the rear. He saw his infantry melt away under something he couldn't comprehend. Thunder, smoke, men falling. No arrows, no spears, no magic, just thunder and death. He sent in the knights. 300 knights in enchanted armor. The colors of the Tevran army. The best of the best. Horses in caparisons. swords blazing with magical fire. They plowed into the crowd of their own retreating infantry, broke through it, emerged onto the field. Beautiful, terrifying, invincible. 60 paces to the trenches. Daniel raised the yellow flag. Artillery. 4 cannons fired a volley of grape shot, simultaneously. 4 tin cans filled with lead exploded over the field. Hundreds of bullets fanned out. The knights were knocked from their horses. Enchanted armor. The best defense in this world. Magical steel tempered by the fire of the elements. It withstands the blow of a sword and a crossbow bolt. It cannot withstand grape shot. Lead bullets traveling at 400 paces per second pierced the enchanted steel like paper. Because no magic is designed for such speed. Because in this world, no one had ever hurled metal with such force. Half the knights fell after the first volley of grape shot, horses in a panic. Screams, the clang of metal. The cannons were reloaded. 30 seconds. A long time. Too long. The remaining knights charged toward the trenches. 40 paces. 30. Wade gave the order. A point-blank volley from the muskets. 20 paces. A volley of grape shot. The knights fell, one after another. Their horses whinnied and thrashed. Not a single one reached the trenches. Not a single one. Tane sat on his horse in the rear and watched. His face was ashen. He had seen the Empire's finest cavalry fall on the field in 3 minutes, without a single sword stroke, without a single magical shield. They simply fell. He turned to the mages, 4 of them, his last hope. He ordered an attack. The mages rode forward, fire in their hands, lightning between their fingers. They raised their hands. Fireballs flew toward the trenches. The first struck the parapet of the front line. An explosion. Stones and earth flew into the air. 3 riflemen were wounded. 1 was killed. Daniel saw it from the hill. He saw a man he knew by name go up in flames from the magical fire. His name was Peter, a former fisherman, 22 years old. He'd volunteered after a pirate battle. Now he was dead. The second fireball struck the second line. The log dugout caught fire. The archers retreated to cover. A third fireball. A fourth. The mages were at work, methodically, like artillery. They were burning the trenches meter by meter. Daniel clenched his fists. Maggie. Where was Maggie? She was on the cliff, alone, far from the trenches. The mages didn't see her. They were looking straight ahead at the positions. But Maggie was to the side, on the flank, 150 paces away. The first shot. The mage on the left flinched. He fell from his horse, a bullet to the neck, between his cloak and his chin. Maggie knew where to aim. A cloak isn't armor, it's a target. Reload. 12 seconds. The second shot. The second mage. A bullet to the chest. He started to raise his shield. Too late. Lead is faster than thought. He fell. The third mage saw it. He spun toward the rock. He raised his hand. A fireball flew toward Maggie's position. She was no longer there. She rolled behind a rock a second before impact. The fireball shattered the rock into rubble. Debris rained down. Maggie peeked out from behind another rock. She took aim. She fired. The mage raised his shield. The bullet struck the shield. It ricocheted. He saw her. He knew where she was. He raised both hands. Lightning. Maggie darted to the right. The lightning struck the rock. The air smelled of ozone. She was alive, but cornered. The mage had her in his sights. The fourth mage continued to set the trenches ablaze. Daniel saw everything from the hill. He saw that Maggie was trapped. He saw that the fourth mage was destroying his positions. Seconds. He had only seconds to make a decision. He raised the green flag, a signal for Wade. Shift fire onto the mages. Wade understood. He deployed the second line. 10 rifled guns. A volley at the third mage, the one holding Maggie. 10 bullets flew toward him. The mage saw them. He managed to raise his shield, head on. 9 bullets hit the shield. 1 went in from the side. It grazed his shoulder. The mage flinched. The shield flickered. For a second. Maggie fired, from behind a rock, into that split-second opening. 170 paces away, at the flickering shield. She hit him. The mage fell. 3 out of 4. The fourth mage saw he was the only one left. He turned his horse around. He galloped back, toward Tane, toward the remnants of the army. Wade wouldn't let him get away. A volley from the second line. 20 paces was too far. But 5 out of 10 bullets hit the horse. The horse collapsed. The mage tumbled to the ground. He stood up, raised his shield, a circular one, maximum protection. He stood alone on the field, behind his shield, as if in a glass sphere. Daniel watched. The mage stood there. The shield burned around him in a ring of fire. He could maintain it for minutes, maybe 10, maybe 20, but not forever. Magic is energy. Energy is finite. Daniel waited. 3 minutes. 5. 7. The shield flickered. It was weakening. The mage was expending his power. By the 10th minute, the shield went out. The mage stood on the field, young, exhausted, his hands hanging limply at his sides. Empty. Maggie took aim. Daniel raised his hand. Stop! He didn't want to kill an unarmed man. Not even a mage. Not even an enemy. Wade sent 2 men. They captured the mage, tied him up. He didn't resist. He had no strength left. Tane saw it all. He saw his mages fall. He saw the cavalry fall. He saw the infantry running back past him. Evening of the 220th day. The field was smoldering. Daniel came down from the hill, slowly. His leg hurt more than it had ever. Every step reverberated through his knee, hip, and spine. He walked and looked at the field, at the bodies, at the mine craters, at the shards of knights' armor that had cost a fortune and failed to save their owners from a piece of lead. He walked past a dead horse, past a broken spear, past a banner with a black eagle trampled into the mud. The smoke stung his eyes. He didn't wipe them. At the foot of the hill they were waiting for him, all of them. Eleanor stood at the front, soot on her cheek, her hands black with gunpowder. She had been forging spare parts for the guns all night before the battle, and all morning while the battle raged. Not a minute's sleep. Next to her was Sora in a scorched apron. She had been preparing charges until the very last second. One of the powder pots cracked in her hands and burned her wrist. She bandaged it with a scrap of cloth and carried on. Maggie stood a little to the side, a rifle slung over her shoulder, her face pale. 3 mages. She had killed 3 mages. She was 19 years old and she had killed people who could burn an entire city with a single gesture. Rowena in a blood-stained dress. She was helping Adelaide at the hospital. An aristocrat. The Duke's a duke. She was stitching up wounds and holding people steady while Adelaide removed the bullets. Her hands were covered in someone else's blood up to her elbows. Adelaide with a bandaged forearm. A piece of shrapnel had cut through her skin when a fireball struck near the hospital. She hadn't noticed until Sora pointed out the blood. She rebandaged it herself, with one hand, and she returned to the wounded. Lena stood behind everyone else, a notebook pressed to her chest. She wrote everything down, every minute of the battle, every order, every volley, every name. She didn't cry, she worked. 14 years old, a child. And she worked like an adult because someone had to take notes, to remember, so that later it would be possible to read and understand what had happened here. Wade stood in front of the line of riflemen, 50 men, dirty, soot-stained, exhausted, alive. Captain Corbin Wade, former Sir, now the commander of a rifle company that had just routed the Imperial Vanguard. A revolver in his hand, a saber at his belt, which he hadn't drawn once during the entire battle. It wasn't needed. Daniel stopped in front of them. He looked at their faces, at every face. Bart, Reed, Murph, young men from among the refugees, Ashford and Trevor's soldiers, the female sharpshooters, everyone. 220 days ago, he'd arrived here in a wagon. A lame boy trapped in a stranger's body. Magicless, useless, exiled to die. And now he stood before the people who had just rewritten the history of this world. Wade dropped to one knee. The archers followed him. Everyone, one after another, like a wave. 100 knees struck the mud. Someone from the back rows called out loudly, "Your Highness, the crown!" Silence. The wind from the sea, smoke over the field. Daniel stood and looked at them, for a long time, silently. Then he took his engineer's apron from his belt. Old, burned through, stained with saltpeter, oil, and bronze dust. He put it on over his nobleman's cloak. Slowly, in front of everyone, he said, "Not the crown. The crown is the end." He looked up at the smoking chimneys of Greystone behind him, the forge, the foundry, the laboratory, the hospital, everything they had built from nothing, from stone and bird droppings and stubbornness. He said, "This is only the beginning for us." Wade was the first to stand. The others followed. No one spoke of the crown anymore. They understood. Their lord was not a king. Their lord was an engineer. And that was more. Because kings come and go, but what an engineer builds remains. Night. Daniel sat on the headland by the lighthouse, alone. Below, Greystone glowed with lights. More lights than 7 months ago, many more. The furnaces were burning. The forge was working even at night. Eleanor was already forging new barrels. The war wasn't over. Tain had retreated but would return. The Empire would not forgive defeat. The Church of the Holy Flame had surely already heard about the thunder from the peninsula. Isaac hadn't backed down. 3 fronts, 3 enemies, and not a single peaceful day ahead. But the city was alive. 2,800 people. There had been 2,000. Now there were 2,800. People came of their own accord. And they'll stay, because there's work here. There's food. There's a roof over their heads. There's a name. There's a place where you aren't beaten for being born in the wrong house. He took Edward Castle's notebook out of his pocket. He opened it to the last page. They didn't come for a machine gun. They came for what I remember about gunpowder. Someone here knows about us. Someone here is looking for us. Daniel closed the notebook. He set it aside. He looked out at the sea. He knew now what he hadn't known on the first day. He had been brought here, not by chance. Someone had chosen him. An arms engineer, not a doctor, not a teacher, not a bridge builder, an arms engineer. Because someone in this world needs gunpowder, needed enough to pull people from another world. And that someone is now looking at Greystone and smiling, because the experiment was a success. Daniel clenched his fists. He wasn't a rat in a maze. He was an engineer. And if someone has built a maze for him, he'll take that maze apart piece by piece and build something of his own from the parts. But that's for later. First things first. Reed brought the news this morning. Word of the battle was spreading like wildfire. In a week, every port along the coast would know about Greystone. In a month, every household. Rowena was already drafting new letters. 3 more lords, 2 more barons. The alliance was growing. Slowly. Just like the real thing. Daniel stood in the smithy and watched Eleanor work. She looked up. She looked at him. She smiled. Her first full, genuine smile. Not a single twitch of the corner of her lips. A smile. He smiled back. She went back to work. He went back to his blueprints. A new project lay on the table. A steam boiler. The simplest design. Water, fire, steam, pressure, motion. The next step on the ladder. After gunpowder, after rifles, after cannons, steam. Then rails, then trains, then factories, then schools, then libraries. Then a world where a commoner with a book is equal to a mage with a staff. A long staircase. He had taken the first step. All that remained was to climb. That evening he convened a council. The last council meeting before a new phase begins. Wade, Hollis, Eleanor, Sora, Maggie, Rowena, Adelaide, Lena. 8 people. His his team, his family. Daniel said that in a month he would begin selling the blueprints for flintlock guns to the 3 neighboring duchies, openly, officially. Silence. Wade asked why. It's their weapon, their advantage. Why give it away? Daniel replied, because gunpowder can't be kept as a secret. A secret can be killed, burned along with a city, buried along with its people. But if 10 cities have gunpowder, it can't be destroyed. If 100 cities have it, it cannot be stopped. His goal is not to make Greystone the only one. His goal is to make Greystone the first. The first in a world where a fisherman with a gun is equal to a mage with a fireball, where a blacksmith with a hammer is equal to a knight with a sword, where an orphan girl with a pencil is equal to a lord with a seal. He doesn't want the crown. He wants the crown to cease to be the only thing that matters. Silence. A long one. Rowena was the first to nod. She understood. This isn't about weapons. It's about power, about who it belongs to, about the fact that a world where a single mage decides the fate of thousands of people is a world that needs to be changed. Not tomorrow, not in a year, but we need to start today. And we need to start by giving, not holding on. Sora nodded silently. Adelaide said that God works through those who give. Then she blushed. Then she straightened up and repeated it without embarrassment. For the first time since her excommunication, she had spoken the word God aloud in front of others, and she felt no shame. Maggie said that if any of the buyers pointed their guns at Greystone, she would personally go there and explain why it was a bad idea. Lena wrote it all down. Every word, every name, every date. Daniel looked at her. In 3 years, she'd marry a young officer in the riflemen, and he'd cry at her wedding. But that was later. Right now, she was just a girl with a pencil, who knows her work is important, because someone gave her a desk with her name on it. Hollis sat in silence. Then he stood up. He walked over to Daniel. He put his hand on his shoulder, the heavy hand of an old blacksmith. He said that his boy Tom would be proud. Not of Daniel. Greystone. The fact that he'd grown up in the very place where he'd drowned. Daniel covered his hand with his own. He said nothing. Words were unnecessary. That night, he made his final entry in the journal for the 220th day. Greystone. 220 days. Population, 2,800. Rifles, 35. Cannons, 4. Archers, 50. Allies, 3 houses. Total casualties, 2 killed. Peter. And the guy from Trevor's group whose name he learned today from Lena. Connor. 2. He'll remember them. Below that, he wrote something that wasn't part of the military report. I don't know who brought me here. I don't know why. I don't know who's watching. But I know one thing. They thought I'd make a weapon. They were right. I did. But I did something else too. I created a place where people want to live, where the outcasts build what their creators rejected, where a blacksmith who lost his son rekindled his forge, where a nameless girl received a desk with her name on it, where an alchemist who was considered a monster saw a nameplate on her laboratory door, where a nun who lost her faith said a prayer once more, where a fisherwoman whom no one ever noticed became the world's best marksman, where an aristocrat who had been used like a coin her whole life made her own decision for the first time, where a captain who hadn't believed in anything for 20 years wept when he was given a 5-shot pistol. Gunpowder is a tool. People are the goal. He set down his pen. He blew out the candle. The wind howled outside the wall. The sea roared against the cliffs. Greystone lived, far to the south, in the capital of the kingdom of Aerland, in a dark study with candles and heavy curtains. A man with a gray beard and intelligent, weary eyes closed the time a message from Greystone. A thin sheet of paper covered in the informant's fine handwriting. Battle. Victory. 2,000 Tevrans, 300 knights, 4 mages, defeated. By 50 riflemen and 4 cannons. The man placed the report in a drawer, locked it. He stood up. He walked over to the window. The city slept. The light of torches on the walls of the royal palace. Silence. He smiled quietly. Not a joyful smile, not a malicious one, a weary one. Like the smile of a man who had waited 20 years for something and had finally gotten it. He turned toward the dark corner of the room where someone was sitting, invisible beyond the reach of the candlelight. He said quietly, "The experiment was a success. Prepare the next one." Silence. Then the rustle of clothing, the creak of a door, footsteps in the hallway. The man with the gray beard returned to the table. He opened another drawer. He took out another folder. A thick one, an old one. On the cover, in faded ink, a single word, archive. He opened it. Inside were dozens of pages, records, names, dates. 200 years of records about people who knew what they could not possibly know, who remembered what did not exist in this world. Weavers, healers, builders, chemists, gunsmiths, each cast into this world like a seed into the earth. Some sprouted, some did not. Edward Castle, a sprout, burned. Davin von Westmark, a sprout, alive, successful. The man ran his finger along the last line. Then he turned the page, a blank page. He picked up his pen. He wrote a name, a new person from another world whom he had found, or who had found him. He set down his pen. He closed the folder. He blew out the candle. Darkness. And in Greystone, on a distant rocky peninsula, the lights of forges and workshops were burning, and smoke rose into the night sky above a place everyone considered a grave. The smoke of the New World's first industrial age.